Brian James Mock was born in the late spring of 1978 in a small, cozy town in Washington state. He was the only child in the family, and his parents did not dote on him. His father, a man strict but fair, worked in construction, and his mother was a schoolteacher. Brian grew up surrounded by care and family warmth, absorbing the best qualities of his parents: hard work, friendliness, and the ability to appreciate the simple pleasures of life. From childhood, he showed curiosity and passion for nature. The forest was a second home for him. His father often took him hunting and fishing, where the boy learned not only to survive in the wild, but also to respect the world around him. He was able to read animal tracks, build a fire even in wet weather, and wait patiently for prey, gazing into the morning mist. These moments, filled with the smell of pine needles and the sounds of the forest, were an integral part of his growing up. In school, Brian was active, outgoing, and friendly. He made friends easily, stayed out of conflicts, and was always ready to help. He had many hobbies: sports, technology, working with wood. Eventually, he found his calling in the field of information technology, and after graduation, he got a job in a company engaged in maintenance of computer networks. Beverly Ann Mauck, née Girth, was born in the early fall of 1981. She grew up in a loving family, surrounded by the care of her parents and older sister. Her childhood was spent in a house full of animals. The family always had several cats, dogs, and even parrots. From an early age, Beverly dreamed of devoting her life to caring for animals, and this love never faded. She had a special gift. She could find a common language even with the most unfriendly people. Friends called her the soul of the company because she was able to diffuse any situation with a joke and supported those who needed a kind word. Studying at college gave her the opportunity to realize her dream. She studied veterinary medicine and at the same time worked in a pet store, helping to take care of pets who were looking for a new home. She and Brian met in the 2000s. They were brought together by a mutual friend who invited them both to a picnic. From the first minutes, a mutual attraction arose between them. They could talk for hours, sharing stories, dreams, and plans for the future. Their love developed naturally, without unnecessary drama or hesitation. They supported each other in everything. Brian admired Beverly's kindness, and she appreciated his reliability. A few years later, in their mid-20s, they married. Their wedding was far from luxurious, a small ceremony among family and friends. Smiles, tears of joy, and vows, said sincerely, from the heart. Soon they moved to a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. This house became the realization of their dream of marital happiness. Brian worked in IT, and Beverly continued to do what she loved, caring for animals. Their life was simple but fulfilling. They spent evenings together, had backyard barbecues, hosted guests, and made plans for the future. One day they wanted to have children, maybe take in a few rescued animals, continue to make the world around them a little kinder. It was a late fall morning, the 17th of November in the year 2007, a day that boded nothing but trouble. A family friend who often hunted with Brian drove up to their house early in the morning. They had agreed to go hunting, as they had done on more than one occasion. However, when he knocked on the door, no one opened. That was odd. Brian always got up on time and was a man of his word. Perhaps he had just fallen asleep? Or changed his mind about going? The friend waited a few minutes, then knocked again. Silence. He wondered if Brian had just decided to sleep longer. It happens after all. After hesitating, he got in the car and went hunting alone. The air was fresh, the woods were quiet, and it looked like the day would be the same as always. However, the worry did not leave him. Thoughts of Brian swirled around in his head. Why hadn't he answered? Why hadn't he given any warning? A few hours later, after driving back, the friend drove up to the Mauck's house again. Brian's car was parked in the same spot. It looked as if no one had gone out or come in. He knocked again. Not a sound. The feeling of unease was growing. Then he decided to look out the window. At first, everything seemed normal in the living room, but then his eyes caught on a strange detail. A foot was visible behind the sofa. His heart beat faster. He looked closer, trying to convince himself it was just an illusion. but a feeling of unease tightened his chest. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed the emergency number. Police arrived on the scene minutes after the call from an alarmed friend. Blue and red flashing lights cut through the morning twilight, and the silence was broken by the officers' brief conversations over the radio. They didn't know what exactly awaited them inside the house, but already the first impression of their surroundings made them wary. The house looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. The front yard was well maintained, the grass cut, the flower beds neatly arranged. But something about the quiet was unnatural. The officers slowly stepped out of their patrol cars. One of them climbed the porch steps, the other walked around the back of the house, checking for possible exit routes. The first thing that caught their eye was the door. It was locked. Not just locked, but clearly slammed shut by someone who had left in a hurry. However, there was an incomprehensible stain on the wooden surface near the doorknob. One of the officers frowned and put on latex gloves. He ran his hand over the doorknob but did not touch it. It was obvious. Something had happened here. He gestured to his partner that it was time to open the door. As soon as they entered, they were greeted by a stifling odor, a mixture of stale air, something metallic, and a faint sour note. Those who had been on such calls often knew the odor all too well. The living room greeted them with an unsettling silence. The room was a mess, but not chaotic, rather strange. There was a mug of unfinished coffee on the coffee table, an upside-down bag of chips lying nearby. The blanket was carelessly crumpled on the couch, and the pillow was lying on the floor as if someone had accidentally dropped it. But then their gazes traveled lower. Behind the couch, half hidden from view, lay a body. The first officer stepped closer, checking for a pulse. Nothing. The man, most likely Brian Mock, was dead. He was lying unnaturally, his right arm stretched out to the side as if he was trying to grab something. The officer looked around the floor and noticed several dark stains that ran from the couch to the hallway. Blood. But not just any blood. There was a distinct boot print on the parquet floor, half imprinted in blood. The second officer immediately fixed it. The perpetrator, by all appearances, had not just been here, but had moved about the house after the attack. At that moment, the second officer's voice sounded from the back of the house. "There's another body here." The team cautiously moved forward. In the bedroom, next to the bed, a woman lay on the carpet. Beverly. She was in her night pajamas, her hair disheveled and a look of horror on her face. There were a few dark drops on the wall beside her as if something had splattered during the struggle. The room wasn't upside down, but the sense of disorder was present. A closet was ajar, one drawer pulled out, a few things scattered on the floor. There was nothing to indicate a robbery, however. Valuables were in place, jewelry was on the dresser, and the laptop was untouched. On the edge of the bed there was a palm mark left in blood. It was strange, like someone was leaning with their hand, but too tentatively, as if swaying. The silence in the house seemed ominous. Only the soft crackle of a walkie-talkie broke the dead silence. The officers scrutinized the house, noting the smallest details. The first thing that caught their eye was the complete lack of signs of forced entry. The front door was locked, the windows were intact, none of them looked broken or forced open. This suggested that the perpetrator was either familiar with the victims and could have entered without forcing his way in, or he knew how to get in without leaving obvious marks. The investigators' attention was immediately drawn to the doorknob. On its surface were dark stains, not just dirty, but with a characteristic brown tint that left no doubt it was blood. The presence of these traces indicated that the perpetrator had left the house after the crime had been committed, which meant that he could have locked the door from the outside. An examination of the kitchen showed that the house was still in order, but there were some details that were out of place. There was a plate of uneaten food on the table, and next to it a mug with the remains of coffee that had already begun to dry on the walls. This could mean that someone had interrupted their dinner or drink suddenly, not of their own free will. It wasn't clear whether the food belonged to the victims or someone else. If the spouses were caught off guard while eating, it could indicate that the perpetrator entered unnoticed. If the food belonged to someone else, it would indicate that the killer may have been in the house before it happened. But the most disturbing findings awaited investigators at the back exit. They found a distinct boot print on the linoleum near the door to the backyard. It was partially mixed with blood, leaving a dark imprint that could help determine the shoe size and model. Judging by the size, the footprint most likely belonged to a man. This meant that the perpetrator had left through the back door, which in turn supported the theory that he had left the scene in a deliberate and confident manner. However, something didn't add up. If the perpetrator was fleeing in a hurry, why did everything around him seem so controlled? At first glance, there seemed to be no active struggle in the house, no scattered things, no knocked out objects, and some details even indicated the presence of a certain order. It was as if someone had wanted it to look ordinary, but that was the main oddity. Besides the marks on the floor, one other detail caught the eye. There was a pack of cigarettes on the windowsill near the back door. The couple themselves, according to their friends, did not smoke, which made this discovery especially strange. The pack looked like it had been forgotten or left behind by accident. But if the killer was careful, could he have made such a mistake? Or was this evidence left behind intentionally? The picture of the crime became increasingly complex. The initial hypothesis of a random attack was losing strength, as the absence of signs of burglary and attempted robbery suggested that the motive of the perpetrator was not related to theft or spontaneous aggression. Most likely, he either knew the victims or had a clear plan of action. The fact that there were two bodies in the house at once confirmed that the killer was not acting on impulse. In cases like this, victims are often given the opportunity to fight back or try to escape, but here it looked like the perpetrator had the upper hand and was in control of the situation. The boot print in the blood indicated movement after the attack. The perpetrator did not just leave the house, but may have lingered there for some time after the murder. The presence of uneaten food in the kitchen confirmed that. He may have spent more time there than would be expected of a person committing a spontaneous murder. The lack of signs of struggle, yet the presence of disorder, created a contradictory feeling. Someone had clearly interacted with the space after the murder but hadn't tried to create chaos. Drawers had not been turned over, valuables were still in place, and the door was locked from the outside, all of which points to forethought. And yet, despite his precautions, the perpetrator left traces, blood stains on the doorknob, a boot print, a pack of cigarettes, perhaps forgotten in a hurry. These details didn't fit the image of a perfect plan. The officers continued to record the evidence, noting every detail. It soon became obvious that the investigation was not a common crime, but a carefully planned murder in which the clues were hidden. But to understand the motive, it was necessary to find out who was the person who left his mark in this house. The police cordoned off the crime scene, and the same day the full-scale work of investigators began. The murder of two people in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood required immediate solving, and every clue could play a decisive role. The first thing the detectives decided to do was to talk to the neighbors. Perhaps someone had seen or heard something unusual, especially that night or early morning. Most of the residents were confused, some claiming they hadn't noticed anything, others recalling minor details, dogs barking, voices behind a wall, or a passing car. But none of this provided concrete leads. However, one of the neighbors was more cooperative. He approached the investigators himself, clearly interested in what was going on, and said that he had seen a suspicious car near the Mock's house. His story seemed detailed, which at first seemed helpful. The neighbor's name was Daniel Tavares. He was 41 years old and lived about 200 yards from the Mock's house. He was known in the neighborhood as a withdrawn and unsociable man who avoided socializing and rarely showed his face on the street. Tavares came forward to the police and stated that he had seen a suspicious car near the Mock's home. He described its make, color, and the people inside in detail. However, detectives were later alerted to the fact that it was impossible to see the details so clearly from such a distance at night. A database check revealed even more disturbing information. Tavares had recently been released from prison for the murder of his mother. This discovery dramatically changed the course of the investigation. His testimony was now viewed with suspicion. He could have been lying in an attempt to divert the investigation, or he could have been involved in the crime himself. Officers began checking his alibi and comparing the evidence they found to see if he really could have been the killer. An autopsy and further ballistics examination revealed that each of the bodies contained 3 bullets. It appears that the victims did not die instantly. The first hits were not fatal but left little chance of escape. Then the final kill shots were fired into each body. Experts determined that the shots were fired from a handgun with a small caliber .22 caliber unitary cartridge. Judging by the trajectory of the hits, the weapon was at different heights during the shooting, which could mean the perpetrator was moving around the house. A footprint on the linoleum found by the back door became one of the most important clues. Experts studied it in detail and found that the sole of the boot had a characteristic pattern inherent in a certain model of footwear. These were tactical boots, often used by military or security guards. The most interesting thing was that the trace was clearly imprinted in the blood, which means that the perpetrator moved around the house after the shots were fired, stepping on the footprints. According to manufacturers, this type of sole was found in several brands, but the main buyers of such shoes were often ex-military, hunters, or people engaged in physical labor. This gave detectives the opportunity to narrow down the suspects. After Daniel Tavares came to the attention of the investigation, detectives began to view him as a prime suspect. His questionable statements, attempt to misdirect the investigation, and criminal history made him the most likely culprit. However, police couldn't rely on hunches alone. Hard evidence was needed. Tavares was called in for questioning. He behaved calmly, denied any involvement in the murder, and even expressed a willingness to help in the search for the real culprit. His demeanor seemed confident. He showed no fear or excitement. He emphasized that he knew nothing about what had happened, and the car near the house Mark noticed accidentally, but the detectives were in no hurry to take his word for it. While the interrogation was going on, criminalists were examining the evidence collected at the scene of the crime. One of the most important findings was Tavares's shoes. Officers noticed that his shoes had a distinctive tread that resembled the print found in the blood at the back door. This coincidence was the first major link in the chain of evidence. Tavares was released after the first interrogation, but he continued to be monitored. Investigators realized they didn't yet have enough evidence to make an arrest, but they were confident they could nail him soon. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were examining the fingerprints found at the Mauk house. When the results of the examination were ready, detectives got the answer they expected. The prints on the doorknob matched those of Daniel Tavares. Now the police had an irrefutable argument. The next day he was called back in for questioning. This time, the investigators took a different tactic. They did not give him the opportunity to maneuver his answers, but presented the facts at once. The evidence spoke for itself. The boot print at the crime scene matched the suspect's shoes. The fingerprints on the doorknob indicated that he had touched the door, which meant he had been inside the house. Tavares tried to stay calm, but when the detectives presented all the evidence they had found, he realized there was no longer any point in denying the obvious. His facial expression changed. He fell silent, sighed heavily, and, after a moment of thought, confessed to the murder. According to Tavares, the reason for the murder was a minor conflict. It all started with a $50 debt. Brian Mock lent him the money, but after a while reminded him about the return. In response, Tavares took it as an insult and felt humiliated. Later, when they ran into each other again, there was a verbal conflict between them, and Brian allegedly said something harsh about him. For a man with a vulnerable ego, this was enough to hold a grudge. He made the decision to take revenge. In the evening, he took the gun he had acquired illegally and went to Mock's house. He knew that the door was often left unlocked and was confident that he would encounter no resistance. When he entered, Brian was in the living room. Tavares drew his gun and, without saying a word, shot him twice, the first bullet hitting him in the chest, the second in the shoulder. Brian staggered and fell to the floor. He fired the final shot into his head to make sure he wouldn't survive. At that moment, Beverly ran out of the bedroom. She saw what had happened and tried to run away, but Tavares pointed his gun at her and shot her twice in the back. She fell down but was still showing signs of life. He then moved closer and fired a final shot to the head. After that, he looked around the house trying to figure out what to do next. He had left his footprints, not realizing they would play against him. After locking the door from the outside, he left through the back exit, stepping in blood, which left a distinctive boot print. The investigation scrutinized Tavares' personality and concluded that he possessed an unstable psychotype characterized by outbursts of anger, vindictiveness, and inability to control emotions. His previous offense, the murder of his mother, already indicated a propensity for violence. After his release from prison, he did not try to reform himself but continued to behave aggressively, taking any remark or conflict as a personal insult. His ego was fragile, and he could not tolerate feeling humiliated. Tavares did not plan the murder in advance, but his character and way of thinking made him prone to relapse. He could not cope with his emotions, and even an occasion as minor as being asked to repay a debt triggered his thirst for revenge. After his confession, he was immediately arrested. Judging from the evidence found and his own testimony, the case against him was virtually flawless. As he was led down the corridor of the police station, he no longer displayed his former self-assured demeanor. All that remained was to wait for the trial, which would determine what sentence he would receive for his second murder. The investigation was at an end. The killer had been found, his motives uncovered, and the evidence collected. Now it was up to Brian and Beverly Mock, whose lives had been cut short by the brutality of a man unable to control his rage. After the investigation and charges were finalized, the case of Daniel Tavares went to trial. The prosecution demanded the harshest possible punishment, believing that this man was a danger to society and should not have a chance for release. Prosecutors emphasized that this was not the first murder committed by Tavares, and his propensity for violence was obvious. The trial began a few months after his arrest. It caught the public's attention, especially after details of his past crime, the murder of his own mother, surfaced in the media. People were outraged that a man who had already committed murder was once again free and able to take the lives of two more innocent people. The prosecutor's office presented murderous evidence to the court. First on the list of key evidence was a boot print in the blood that matched Tavares' shoe. Then came the fingerprints found on the doorknob, which confirmed his presence in the victim's home. This was supplemented by ballistics testing, which showed that all 6 bullets were fired from the gun found in Tavares' possession when he was arrested. Despite the overwhelming evidence, defense counsel attempted to build a defense line focusing on the fact that the crime was not premeditated. Emphasis was placed on the defendant's emotional state, his tendency to act impulsively, and the fact that he was under extreme stress at the time of the murder. The key point, however, was that Tavares had already confessed to the crime under questioning. He detailed exactly how he killed Brian and Beverly Mock, which left the defense with no chance of a full acquittal. When the prosecutor read his confession, there was a tense silence in the courtroom. The relatives of the victims present could hardly contain their emotions as they listened to him describe his actions in cold blood. He described how he first shot Brian twice and then, when he fell, finished him off with a follow-up shot. He then stalked Beverly, shot her in the back, and then fired a final shot to the head. These words came as a real shock to the audience. Several witnesses were heard at the trial, and every story, every detail told by them reinforced the tragic nature of what happened. Friends and relatives of Brian and Beverly spoke one after the other, telling about how the murdered were in life, what kind and bright people Tavares had dealt a fatal blow to. Beverly's mother's speech was a particularly heavy moment. When she rose, there was an oppressive silence in the hall. Her voice shook and tears glistened in her eyes, but she mustered the strength to speak. She recalled how cheerful and kind her daughter had been, how she had dreamed of caring for animals since childhood, how she had truly believed in goodness. She told how Beverly and Brian dreamed of the future, how they made plans for family life, planned to have children and create a cozy home. She asked the court a rhetorical question. Why were her daughter and son-in-law killed? After all they wanted was to live happily and not to harm anyone. A family friend, who knew both the victims and Tavares, also spoke. She said that Daniel used to come to the Mauch's house, that they treated him kindly, never turned away, tried to help him. She emphasized that Brian was a person who always lent a helping hand, even if he didn't expect anything in return. That's why he loaned Tavares money, hoping that he would pay back when he could. No one could even imagine that this insignificant amount of money, a mere $50, would be the reason why their lives would be cut short. When the day came for the verdict, the courtroom was filled with people. The jury retired to deliberate, and the wait lasted several hours. When they returned, the judge read their verdict, guilty on all counts. In February 2008, the court found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, as well as unlawful possession of a weapon. The sentence was harsh but expected: life in prison without parole. Heather Nicole Maples was born on October 27, 9992, in the small town of Smyrna, Tennessee. Her parents, Brian and Terry Maples, always said that their daughter was a sunny child, energetic, smiling, with an abiding curiosity about the world. She grew up in a loving and supportive environment, surrounded by a caring family and loyal friends. From an early age, Heather showed an interest in the arts and communications. At school, she participated in theater productions, easily communicated with people, and dreamed of one day working in the media. Her loved ones recalled that she was a person who could listen, support, and energize others with positivity. When it came time to choose a college, Heather decided to enroll at Middle Tennessee State University, MTSU, in Murfreesboro. It was a conscious decision. The university offered an excellent communications major program that perfectly matched her dreams of a career in television or radio. In addition, Murfreesboro was close to her hometown, allowing her to stay in close contact with her family. The move was a big step for Heather to live independently. She quickly settled into the student community, made new friends, and even worked part-time in one of the local restaurants. The girl was popular among her peers. Her smile and easygoing nature made her feel at ease. August 6, 2015 began as a normal day. Heather woke up in her apartment at Cedar Creek Apartments, a small but cozy place where mostly students and young professionals lived. She was going to make the most of the day by going for a jog in the park in the morning, then going to her favorite coffee shop and spending a few hours working on her next class project. In the afternoon, she met up with her friends, including Lauren and Jessica, 2 of her closest friends. They discussed plans for the upcoming school semester, talked about the future, laughed, and made plans for the evening. That evening, Heather and her friends decided to relax a little. They went to one of the local bars, a place where students often spent time listening to live music and enjoying the atmosphere. Heather was in a good mood, joking, dancing, and seemed perfectly happy. Toward midnight, the girls began to disperse. Heather also decided it was time to go home. She ordered a cab and wrote in the common chat room of her friends that she had arrived safely. That was her last message. The next morning, August 7, Lauren and Jessica waited for a message from Heather. Usually, she always texted in general chat, telling them how the night had gone, sharing her plans for the day, but this time her phone remained silent. At first, the girls didn't pay much attention to it. Perhaps Heather had simply slept longer than usual after a busy evening. However, the more time passed, the more their anxiety grew. An hour passed, then another. Jessica decided to text Heather in private messages, but there was no response. They tried to convince themselves that there was no reason to panic, but the anxious feeling wouldn't let go. At noon, Jessica tried calling, but the call immediately went straight to voicemail. Lauren sent another message, but it too went unread. The girls began to remember the events of the previous evening. They knew for sure that Heather had gotten home because she had written about it in the chat room before going to bed. It was unlikely that she just couldn't hear her phone. She usually answered messages quickly, even if she was busy. Perhaps she'd forgotten to charge the device? Or worse, gotten sick? By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, their anxiety had peaked. They could no longer just sit and wait. Lauren offered to drive to her house to make sure she was okay. Jessica immediately agreed, and soon they were outside the Cedar Creek Apartments complex where their friend lived. When they got to the apartment, Lauren knocked on the door, but there was only silence. She knocked again, more insistently, but no one answered. The thought crept into her head that maybe Heather had spent the night at someone she knew, but that didn't sound like her. The feeling that something was wrong was growing stronger and stronger. Looking around the entrance, the girls noticed a strange detail. The door was slightly ajar. Heather always locked it, even if she went out for a while. It looked unusual and only made them more anxious. They cautiously peeked inside. The apartment was unusually quiet. At first glance, everything looked normal. There were books on the table, a cup of coffee next to the sink, and a blanket lying on the couch, as if its owner had just gotten up and was going to continue her day. Yet there was something wrong in the air, elusive but frightening. As Lauren and Jessica moved on, they felt their hearts begin to beat faster. They looked around, taking in the familiar interior, but suddenly they came upon something they never expected to see. Shock pierced them, robbing them of their ability to breathe for a moment. There was a heavy, oppressive silence in the room. Everything around them froze. Seconds stretched into infinity until one of the girls grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook, but the words were clear. "Help is needed. We need to get there now." Police arrived on the scene about 10 minutes later. A car with its blinkers on braked smoothly in front of the Cedar Creek Apartments, and 2 officers, a detective and forensic examiners, rushed inside. It was clear from the first glance at the front door of apartment 269 that the situation required immediate intervention. The door was ajar, which in itself looked suspicious. The officers knew that most people carefully lock their doors, especially young women living alone. Upon closer inspection, they noticed that the doorknob and the area around the lock looked intact. There were no signs of forced entry, scratches or damage indicating forced entry. However, the mere fact that the door was unlocked was a red flag. Upon entering the apartment, the police immediately sensed the oppressive silence that usually accompanies tragedy scenes. The air was still, and there was no sign of life in the room. Everything seemed frozen, as if time had stood still. Looking around the room, the officers took note of details. There was nothing in the hallway that indicated clutter or fighting. Shoes stood neatly by the entrance. Keys rested on the nightstand. The living room had the familiar, slightly chaotic coziness of a student apartment. A few magazines spread out on the table, a coffee cup left over from the morning breakfast lying in the corner. But as his gaze traveled farther, a disturbing pattern emerged. The bedroom clearly felt like a life that had stopped. The sheets on the bed were crumpled, the pillow dumped on the floor. On the floor beside the bed lay an open purse with her wallet and scattered belongings peeking out of it. It looked unnatural, as if someone had rummaged through it or it had fallen in a hurry. The body of a young woman was lying on the bed, slightly turned on its side. At first glance, it might have looked like she was just sleeping, but the lack of movement, the unnatural posture, and the pallor of her skin said otherwise. Her long blonde hair was disheveled, tangled strands partially covering her face. Her arms rested limply beside her body, and small abrasions were visible on her wrists. One of the officers cautiously approached, checked for a pulse at the neck, then at the wrist. There were no signs of life. The woman was dead. The detective took a step forward, examining the body more closely. At a glance, there were a few disturbing details. There were reddish marks on the neck, as if left by the pressure of a hand or belt. This indicated possible asphyxia. There were bruises on her forearms and elbows, and marks on the inside of her knees and thighs that looked like signs of a struggle. The girl's clothes were carelessly crumpled, which could suggest violent behavior before death. Her face seemed tense, even in stillness, as if she had experienced intense fear or pain in the last second of her life. There were no signs of struggle in the room that would suggest a surprise attack, so perhaps her attacker was not a stranger to her. Neither the windows nor the door were damaged, which could indicate that she herself let in the person who caused her death. The police began to analyze the circumstances and began to build the first versions of what had happened. Judging from the apartment and the condition of the body, it was obvious that the young woman's death was not accidental or natural. Detectives carefully examined the scene, trying to establish the chronology of events and the motive for the crime. One of the first assumptions was that the girl herself let the person who eventually caused her death into the apartment. There were a number of factors that pointed to this. First, there were no signs of forced entry on the door. No one tried to get inside by force, which means that the deceased could voluntarily open the door. In addition, her purse, phone, and personal belongings were left in place, which ruled out the version of a break-in for the purpose of robbery. If the perpetrator had wanted to take something of value, he would surely have carried away a purse, appliances, or other items. This conclusion meant that the police had to check the victim's surroundings, who she had been socializing with in the last few days, who she could have let into the house without suspicion and without feeling threatened. Another possible scenario was that Heather let an acquaintance into the apartment, but the situation got out of hand. The signs of struggle on her body could indicate that there was a conflict between her and her attacker that escalated into violence. It may have started with a simple argument or disagreement, but then the guest used force, overpowered her resistance, and committed a crime. This was indicated by bruises on her arms and compression marks on her neck. They showed that the victim tried to defend herself but lost in this struggle. It is likely that the perpetrator did not plan the murder in advance, and his actions were spontaneous, caused by anger, fear, or other emotions. The forensic scientists suggested that the death occurred hours earlier, most likely during the night or pre-dawn hours. This gave the police the basis for another theory. The perpetrator may have been in the apartment when the victim was about to go to sleep. If the murder occurred at night, it means that Heather either invited someone to visit late in the evening, or the person entered the apartment without her knowledge. However, the lack of signs of forced entry made the second option less likely. So, this person was with her consensually, but then the situation changed. Each of these versions required confirmation or refutation, and detectives knew that any, even the most insignificant evidence, could become decisive in solving the crime. After an initial examination of the crime scene, investigators began to form a basic working theory. The killer was not a random intruder, but was likely someone Heather knew. This was indicated by several facts: the absence of signs of forced entry, the closed door, the nature of the marks on the body, and the position of things in the apartment. The girl either let the criminal in, or he was inside the apartment with her consent. Soon forensic experts made an important discovery. Fingerprints left in blood were found on the sheet next to the body. This was a key piece of evidence as it could be used to identify the killer. In addition, while examining Heather's body, experts recorded the presence of biological traces, which could also provide important clues. Both types of evidence were sent for laboratory examination, but it took time to process. In parallel, the investigation began to check the environment of the deceased. Detectives found out with whom she had been communicating in recent days, studied her correspondence and calls. Gradually, the picture of events began to become clearer. One of those who often came to light when studying her communication was Brandon Bowling, a former student at Middle Tennessee State University, MTSU, who had studied with Heather. Their acquaintance began years ago when they crossed paths at a university event. Bowling had shown interest in her, but their relationship did not go beyond buddy-buddy communication. Brandon was born and raised in Tennessee. His life was not outstanding, an ordinary childhood, school years, and then going to university. However, unlike Heather, who was cheerful and made friends easily, Brandon seemed more withdrawn. He did not have a wide social circle, often kept to himself. At university, he studied criminology, which later became an ironic twist of fate. From the outside, he appeared intelligent and polite, but many people who knew him intimately were left with a sense of unsettling unpredictability in his behavior. At times he could be friendly, but at other times he could be withdrawn and irascible. This was especially evident when he faced rejection or misunderstanding. Investigators learned that in the weeks before the tragedy, Brandon had been trying to reconnect with Heather. He texted her and invited her to meet, but she politely distanced herself. The last time they were seen together was shortly before her death, which became an important lead for the police. In an attempt to reconstruct the last hours of Heather's life, police examined surveillance footage from the Cedar Creek apartments. One episode caught their attention. On the night of the murder, shortly before the estimated time of death, the cameras captured the silhouette of a man entering the building. The image was fuzzy, but analysis of the gait and build suggested that it could be Brandon Bowling. In addition, other cameras near bars where Heather was spending the evening with friends confirmed that Brandon was nearby. One eyewitness, a student who was also lounging at the bar that night, recalled seeing them together. He could not say exactly what they were talking about, but noted that Brandon seemed tense. These facts allowed the police to draw an important conclusion. Brandon was the last person to see Heather before her death. For now, however, that wasn't enough to convict. More evidence was needed. Determined to waste no time, the police called Brandon in for questioning. When he received the summons, he showed little excitement, but his reaction was wary. At first glance, he held himself calmly, but the experienced investigators immediately noticed that there was something unnatural in his behavior. He often avoided direct gaze, answered in short phrases, and at times was confused about details. When asked where he had been on the night of the murder, he replied that he had been at home. However, he was unable to provide a convincing alibi. No one could confirm that he had indeed spent the night alone. The investigators purposely asked the same questions several times, but with different wording. They noticed that Brandon answered them in different ways, sometimes confusing the details. When the conversation turned to Heather, he started to get nervous. He claimed that he hadn't seen her in a while and that they hadn't had any conflicts, but his behavior said otherwise. But the detectives realized that it wasn't enough to make an arrest, but enough to keep checking on him. They decided to wait for the results of the forensics, which could provide stronger evidence of his involvement. After the interrogation, the investigators went back to analyzing the evidence they had collected. At this point, they had a few important details that pointed to Brandon Bowling, but all of them remained circumstantial. CCTV cameras had captured a man who looked like him near Heather's house on the night of her death. This coincidence seemed too significant to ignore. In addition, witnesses recalled seeing him at the bar where the girl was vacationing a few hours before the alleged time of the crime. However, this evidence was insufficient to convict him. Brandon's alibi was questionable. He claimed to have been at home on the night of the murder, but could not corroborate this with any conclusive evidence. No one had seen him. No one could say he was really alone. When questioned, he seemed uncertain, answered vaguely, confused about details, and at times appeared to be trying to avoid direct answers. This behavior only served to heighten suspicion. Despite all this, the police did not yet have hard evidence that would allow them to press charges. All they had so far was a series of circumstances that pointed to Brandon, but didn't prove his guilt. Investigators realized they needed something more, evidence that would definitively link him to the crime scene. That's why the crime lab continued to work with the physical evidence found in the apartment. The fingerprints found on the sheet were clear enough to be identified. However, reconciliation was time-consuming. In addition, other biological evidence had been sent for analysis, but the results had not yet been received. The investigation realized that if they wanted to arrest Brandon, they needed to get hard evidence of his involvement. Until that happened, he remained the prime suspect, but without formal charges. Detectives continued to monitor his behavior, watch his reactions, and wait for the results of the forensic tests. Knowing that the truth was about to be revealed, several weeks had passed since the crime, and finally the crime lab provided police with the long-awaited forensic results. The biological materials found on Heather Maple's body gave an exact match to Brandon Bowling's DNA. This became the first conclusive evidence of his presence in the apartment at the time of her death. Additionally, analysis of the fingerprints left in the blood on the sheet confirmed that they also belonged to Brandon. There was no doubt now. He had been in her apartment that fateful night. The police knew it was time for a decisive move. However, instead of making an immediate arrest, the detectives decided to use a tactical trap. They called Brandon in for a second interview without reporting any new evidence. The goal was to give him a chance to reiterate his false alibi and then present him with evidence that he would not be able to walk away from. Brandon came to the police station as he had the first time, trying to remain calm. However, the investigators immediately noticed that he was nervous. He knew that the police were still investigating and probably suspected that he had been called in again for a reason. The beginning of the interrogation was almost identical to the first. The detective again questioned him about where he had been on the night of the murder. Brandon repeated his earlier version. He was supposedly at home and did not leave. He was then asked if he knew anything about what had happened to Heather. He again denied any involvement, pretending to be genuinely shocked by what had happened. The detectives listened attentively, allowing him to give his full version of events. They didn't interrupt him, didn't ask him any additional questions, just waited. When he finished speaking, the investigator unfolded a folder of forensic tests and slowly laid out the results of the analysis in front of him. First up was the biological trace report. Brandon's DNA was found on Heather's body. Next was the analysis of the fingerprints. They matched the ones left on the bed in her bedroom. The room fell into a tense silence. Brandon froze. His face paled. He clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. He tried to say something but stammered. "We know you were in her apartment that night, Brandon, and we have irrefutable proof," the detective said quietly but confidently. Bowling swallowed. He realized that his alibi had crumbled to dust. Realizing that it was pointless to lie any further, Brandon, sighing heavily, admitted that he had indeed been in Heather's apartment that night. He revealed that they had met after the party and he had walked her home. According to him, there was intimacy between them, but he claimed it was consensual. However, this account clearly contradicted what the forensic investigators found. The investigators listened intently, giving him a chance to speak. Brandon was careful not to mention violence, avoiding any details of a struggle or signs of strangulation. He emphasized that the two of them had supposedly entered into the intimacy voluntarily, and he said there should have been no tragedy. But the detectives already knew too much to believe that version. They showed him forensic photographs, marks on his neck characteristic of strangulation, bruises on his body indicative of a struggle. All of this suggested that the victim had fought back and that her death was not accidental. Brandon's face tensed. He felt the situation was getting out of his control. He tried to keep insisting that he hadn't meant to kill anyone, but everything he said only made it worse. The detective wasted no more time. He rose from his seat and spoke coldly. "Brandon Bowling, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Heather Maples." Two officers immediately entered the room and put his hands behind his back. He didn't resist. It seemed that the last vestiges of hope had left him. Handcuffs were snapped on his wrists. From that moment on, he was no longer just a suspect. He became a defendant. The investigators knew they had a trial ahead of them, where the defense would try to put his story in a favorable light. But all the evidence spoke against him, and now the police had everything they needed to see the case through. After Brandon Bowling's arrest, the Rutherford County Prosecutor's Office filed formal charges against him. He was charged with rape and first-degree murder. The case caused widespread public outcry, especially among MTSU students, who were shocked that the perpetrator was a man from their circle. The trial began in 2018. Prosecutors presented the court with exhaustive evidence gathered during the investigation. Surveillance footage that proved Brandon was outside Heather's apartment the night of the crime. Forensic reports showing signs of struggle, strangulation and sexual assault, and DNA analysis that definitively linked Bowling to the crime scene. The defense attempted to build a line of defense based on Brandon's initial statements that the intimacy with Heather was consensual. However, this argument completely collapsed in the face of the evidence presented by the prosecution. The forensic examination unequivocally pointed to the violent nature of the incident: numerous bruises, scratches, marks on the wrists, and, most importantly, strangulation. In addition, the prosecution presented a psychological characterization of Brandon, which showed that he had a violent temper and did not tolerate rejection. This was consistent with the investigation's theory that the crime may have been caused by his anger at Heather, who did not want to continue a relationship with him. Throughout most of the trial, Brandon Bowling denied being guilty of murder. He argued that Heather's death was a tragic accident, not a deliberate act, but the result of circumstances that spiraled out of control. However, during the hearing, the prosecution presented compelling evidence that gradually demolished his version. Forensic tests, evidence analysis, and witness testimony increasingly cast doubt on his initial claims. About halfway through the trial, realizing that he would have to answer for what he had done, Bowling decided to change his testimony. He agreed to cooperate with the investigation and admitted that he had indeed been at Heather's apartment that night. He frankly revealed that there had been intimacy between them and confirmed that it was an unintentional crime, but a tragic situation that he had failed to prevent. As he began to speak, you could feel the tension and remorse in his voice. He claimed that he did not mean to hurt Heather and did not realize that his actions could lead to such an unfortunate outcome. According to him, it had started out as a normal evening, but something had gone wrong. He did not try to deny his presence, but continued to insist that he did not want her death and that what happened was an accident. The court listened carefully to what he said, but took into account the evidence presented, which showed clear signs of a struggle. Although his confession was an important moment in the trial, and the defense hoped it would mitigate the possible punishment, the prosecution continued to insist that what happened could not be seen simply as a tragic accident. After considering all of the evidence presented, including forensic medical examinations, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and the defendant's own confession to the rape, the court issued its final verdict. On February 6, 2018, the Rutherford County Court found Brandon Bowling guilty of rape and second-degree murder. His sentence was 40 years in prison for second-degree murder and 15 years for rape without the possibility of parole. Both sentences will run concurrently. The verdict was met with relief from Heather's family and friends. The girls' family members who attended the trial could not hold back tears. Their daughter, sister, and friend would never come back, but at least justice had been served. Brandon Bowling was taken into custody and sent to a maximum security correctional facility where he was to spend the rest of his life. Allie was born on November 27, 1997 in St. Louis, Missouri to Gary and Cindy Costiel. Her childhood was filled with nurturing family values and lessons in self-development. Her parents always supported her, encouraged her interests, and helped her overcome challenges. During her school years, Allie attended Lindbergh Middle School, where she was known as a bright and tireless activist. In addition to excellent grades, she participated in student council, played sports, and was known for her enthusiasm for volunteering. Her drive to learn and desire to excel led her to the University of Mississippi, where she chose to major in marketing and finance. Allie dreamed of a career related to corporate management or owning her own business. She often shared her plans with friends and even kept a blog where she talked about life on campus, healthy living, and her hobbies. In her free time, she was active in fitness, attended yoga classes, and loved spending time outdoors. However, Allie's life wasn't just about accomplishments. In her surroundings appeared a man whose influence on her fate turned out to be fatal. Brandon Thiesfeld, Allie's age and a student at the same university, seemed to be the complete opposite of the girl. Brandon was born on April 15, 1997 in Fort Worth, Texas, to Marvin and Carol Thiesfeld. His parents owned a successful business, and Brandon grew up in comfort with few needs. Their low-key parenting style, however, left some gaps in his character, according to family acquaintances. The young man was known for his independence, but this trait often degenerated into secrecy and a tendency to rash actions. During his school years, Brandon showed aptitude for learning, but rarely brought things to completion. Once at the University of Mississippi, he stood out more for his reticence than his success. His entourage described him as someone with an unpredictable demeanor who could be charming but often lost interest in people. Nevertheless, he had a certain charisma that attracted those around him. Allie and Brandon met in early 2018 at a college party. Their first meeting was casual, but soon there was an interaction between them that developed into a romantic relationship. This relationship, as Allie's friends later said, was full of contradictions. Brandon often showed indifference, did not respond to messages, postponed meetings. Allie, on the other hand, tended to be open and serious, which created disagreements. They often quarreled, but the girl apparently did not lose hope for change. Over time, the tension in their relationship increased. In the summer of 2019, Ali stayed in Oxford, focusing on her studies and her projects. Her life remained in full view of friends and acquaintances, and her active activities did not raise suspicions of any mood change. Brandon, on the other hand, behaved differently. He was less often seen on campus, and he was off campus more and more often. As it later turned out, these trips were related to important decisions that investigators believe were pivotal to the tragic events. By that point, their relationship was on the verge of breaking down, but Ali still tried to keep in touch. According to her friends, she discussed a topic with Brandon that likely involved their shared future. This topic, as would later be revealed, is what drove the young man to the actions that ruined both of their lives. The morning of July 20th, 2019 started out like any other for the Lafayette County, Mississippi Police Department. Around noon, however, a disturbing call came into the sheriff's department. A patrol officer had discovered the body of a young woman in a secluded area near Sardy Lake, a popular destination for locals and University of Mississippi students. The location, known for its natural beauty and tranquility, has now become the center of a forensic investigation. The body, later identified as Alexandria Ali Costiel, lay on the side of a gravel road leading to the fishing area. At first glance, it appeared that she had been killed right there, but a close examination of the scene revealed signs of a struggle. The grass around her was mussed. There were footprints on the ground that resembled shoe marks of various sizes, and clear signs that someone had moved the body. These details immediately suggested that Ali had probably fought back against her attacker. Forensic investigators found several gunshot wounds on the girl's body. The scene itself indicated violence. Her clothes were damaged, which could indicate a scramble before the shots were fired. The weapon used by the perpetrator was not found at the scene, but investigators found bullets that later helped identify the weapon. It was clear early on that this murder was cold-blooded and premeditated. Ali's personal belongings were nearby. Her bag, phone, and keys were left untouched. This detail immediately ruled out robbery as a motive for the crime. Moreover, Ali's cell phone, found at the scene, became a key element of the investigation. Analyzing its data could give investigators an insight into the last hours of her life, as well as help to reconstruct her route of travel and identify with whom she had been in contact that day. The surrounding area was thoroughly surveyed by forensic investigators. Lake Sardy, with its picturesque shores and dense forests, seemed to be an ideal vacation spot, but its isolation also made it a suitable place to hide a crime. Forensic experts collected soil and vegetation samples that may have been transferred to the perpetrator's clothing or shoes. They also recorded tire tracks found on the road near the body that indicated the use of a vehicle. They were able to determine from the depth and shape of the tracks that they belonged to a mid-sized pickup truck, a common type of vehicle in the area. Of particular interest to investigators were signs of a struggle that were evident at the scene. The vegetation around Ali's body was mussed and the ground beneath her feet was loosened. This indicated that the girl had tried to resist her attacker. There were abrasions and bruises on her body and scratches on her arms, which confirmed the theory that she was defending herself. Such details suggested that Ali knew her attacker and was likely trapped when she realized she was in danger. These details became key to the investigation. Signs of a struggle suggested that the attack was spontaneous or the victim felt threatened at the last moment. Investigators immediately began looking at her circle of acquaintances, as the location of the crime was remote enough that it was highly likely that she had been taken there by force. For the perpetrator, the location was a convenience because of its isolation, but for the police it was a treasure trove of evidence, despite the seeming difficulty of finding it. When forensic investigators examined Ali's body, they discovered that she was wearing a smart gadget on her wrist, an Apple Watch. This device became a crucial element in the reconstruction of her last hours. The watch recorded the time of her movements and then a sudden cessation of activity, which coincided with the estimated time of death. Ali's cell phone, found nearby became another important source of information. Digital experts immediately began analyzing her correspondence, calls, and social networks. It was soon discovered that the last person she had been in contact with was Brandon Teesfeld, an acquaintance and student at the University of Mississippi. The correspondence between them had been strange. Allie had suggested several times that they meet to discuss an important topic, to which Brandon had responded evasively or not at all. These messages were the first signal of his possible involvement. Despite the remoteness and isolation of the crime scene, investigators found plenty of evidence. In addition to tire tracks and signs of a struggle, microparticles that could have belonged to the perpetrator were found at the scene. Fabric fibers, shoe impressions, and particles transferred from a vehicle or clothing could provide forensic investigators with important clues. Each find was carefully documented and sent to a laboratory for analysis. In addition, analysis of the bullets found in and around the body helped determine the type of weapon. It was a small caliber handgun, indicating that the perpetrator was cold-blooded. The weapon was not found at the scene, indicating that the killer was trying to cover his tracks. However, investigators realized that such a find could be a clue to identifying the perpetrator and began checking a database of registered guns. News of the incident quickly spread throughout Lafayette County and beyond. For area residents, Sardy Lake has always been a symbol of quiet and safety. This place has always been quiet. We used to come here a lot with our families. No one would think something like this could happen here, shared a local resident who regularly came to the lake to fish. For students at the University of Mississippi, the murder came as a shock. Allie was known to many as a friendly and active person, and her death caused deep anxiety among those who knew her. Discussions began on campus about safety and how to prevent similar tragedies. As the investigators analyzed the evidence, the picture of the incident began to become clearer. Based on the watch phone and crime scene evidence, it was clear that Allie had been murdered by someone she knew. The likelihood that she had volunteered to meet this person in a secluded location heightened suspicion. Analyzing the digital data gave detectives a list of potential suspects. However, correspondence with Brandon Teesfeld and his evasive responses made him the centerpiece of the case. Investigators began gathering additional information about his movements and behavior in the days leading up to the murder. The crime scene became the starting point for the investigation. All the evidence found, from digital data to physical footprints, gave investigators a clear picture of what happened. A timeline of events was reconstructed. Allie was likely brought to the crime scene on the evening of July 19th, where the fight that ended with her murder took place. The evidence indicated that the crime had been planned in advance, and the only question remained: who was willing to commit such a cold-blooded act? One of the first tasks of the investigation was to reconstruct the route of Allie's movements on the night of her murder. To do this, the investigators used data from her Apple Watch, which recorded her movements, heart rate, and time intervals of activity. The device showed that the girl left the University of Mississippi campus on the evening of July 19, 2019, and headed to a secluded spot on the outskirts, where her body was found the next morning. The clock activity stopped around 2 a.m., giving detectives the exact time of the presumed death. Allie's cell phone data also played an important role. Messages sent in the hours before her death showed that she was actively communicating with Brandon Teesfeld. The correspondence was intense, with Allie suggesting a meeting several times and Brandon responding evasively before agreeing. This interaction was an important link in connecting the two and reconstructing the chain of events that led to the tragedy. Brandon's browser history, examined later, also provided valuable clues. In the days before the murder, he had searched for information about covering up crime scenes and also inquired about how ballistics evidence linked guns to bullets. This reinforced suspicions that the murder was planned. The next step was to examine kept footage. At one of the intersections leading to Sardy Lake, a pickup truck was recorded that was later found to belong to Brandon Teesfeld. The camera captured the vehicle shortly before the estimated time of Allie's death, and again a short time later when the vehicle had left the area. This fact allowed investigators to link Brandon to the crime scene at a critical time. Tire tracks were found at the crime scene that matched the tires of Brandon's pickup truck. The depth and tread pattern confirmed the identity, which meant that his vehicle was at the crime scene. This became one of the main physical evidence of his involvement. In addition, forensics found signs of a struggle near Allie's body. Dimpled grass, scratches on her arms, and damage to her clothing indicated that the victim had tried to fight back. Shoe prints left at the scene matched the size and model of the shoes found in Brandon's possession during the search. This evidence confirmed that he was at the scene and participated in the event. The testimony of Allie's friends and acquaintances helped to understand her final days and her relationship with Brandon. Close friends recalled that the girl was tense about an upcoming conversation with him. The friends claimed that she was discussing a sensitive issue with Brandon that involved their personal relationship. Supposedly, it was about a possible pregnancy, although this information was never officially confirmed. Other witnesses spoke about Brandon's character. He was known for his reticence and tendency to avoid serious discussions. In the days before the murder, his behavior became even more erratic. He avoided socializing, appeared nervous, and frequently left campus. These details gave investigators the impression that he was preparing for some serious action. Bullets were found at the crime scene and became key evidence. Ballistics testing revealed that they were fired from a small caliber handgun. The investigation revealed that Brandon owned this type of gun, although it was not registered. A check of his bank transactions revealed that he had purchased ammunition that matched the bullets found shortly before the murder. This was further evidence of his connection to the crime. Although no gun was found, the type of ammunition left at the crime scene matched the ammunition registered in the area of his last purchase. The investigation believed that Brandon may have gotten rid of the gun after the murder to conceal the connection between it and the crime. Investigators also focused on Brandon's behavior and motivations. His friends and acquaintances described him as someone who tended to avoid responsibility. This was consistent with the behavior described in his correspondence with Allie. He avoided discussing difficult topics and refused to make decisions that could change his life. These character traits may have played a key role in his actions on the night of the murder. The likely motive for the crime began to become clearer as investigators began to analyze the nature of their relationship. Allie had hoped to have a frank conversation with Brandon about a possible pregnancy, but Brandon probably perceived the situation as a threat to his normal lifestyle. His fear of change, amplified by the possible tension in their communication, may have led him to decide to eliminate the problem in the most drastic way possible. During the investigation, investigators concluded that Allie likely volunteered to meet Brandon at Sardy Lake, unaware of his intentions. Data from her cell phone and watch, evidence at the scene, and surveillance footage helped reconstruct the events of that night. Brandon apparently drove her to a secluded location where a confrontation ensued that ended in tragedy. The body of evidence, including digital data, ballistics evidence, and witness testimony, left no doubt of his involvement. After obtaining an arrest warrant, detectives began searching for Brandon Thiesfeld, who by then had already left campus. After Allie's murder, Brandon did not return to campus, which immediately raised suspicions. For the first few days after the tragedy, he did not return calls or texts, avoiding all communication with friends and acquaintances. It was later learned that he had left campus the night of the murder, heading to Memphis, Tennessee. This information was confirmed through cell tower data that recorded his phone signal. Friends and acquaintances told police that Brandon had been visibly tense in recent weeks and completely disappeared after the incident. One of his buddies mentioned that Brandon had packed up his belongings in his pickup truck and said he needed to take care of business. These details reinforced suspicions that he was trying to flee. Lafayette County Police contacted their Tennessee counterparts and relayed information about the wanted man to them. An arrest warrant was turned over to Memphis, where a pickup truck matching the license plates and description of Brandon's vehicle was spotted in a suburb. Surveillance cameras at a gas station on the south side of the city captured his vehicle, giving police the opportunity to arrange an arrest. On July 24, 2019, Brandon Thiesfeld was apprehended without resistance. Police officers surrounded his vehicle at a gas station when he stopped to refuel. At the time of his apprehension, Brandon looked exhausted but remained calm. His first statement to the officers was, "I didn't do anything." Despite his denial, the arrest was conducted in a proper manner and the suspect was transported to the local police department. During the search of his pickup truck, police found a number of clues that were crucial to the investigation. A weapon matching the description of the gun used in Ali's murder was found in the vehicle. It was in the glove compartment and traces matching ballistics were later found on it. In addition, the same type of ammunition used at the crime scene was found in the car. Forensic experts also recorded bloodstains on the seats and clothes that were lying in the cabin. These traces were sent for forensic examination, which confirmed that the blood belonged to Ali. This fact became the key evidence that Brandon was directly involved in her murder. After his arrest, Brandon was taken to the police station for questioning. Investigators immediately noticed that he seemed distant and avoided direct answers to questions. During the first hours of the interrogation, he insisted on his innocence, claiming that he was at home on the night of the murder. However, this version was contradicted by cell phone data and video recordings that confirmed his presence at the crime scene. When presented with the evidence collected, including blood traces and ballistics evidence, Brandon became withdrawn and refused to testify further. His attorney, appointed hours after his arrest, advised him to remain silent until trial. Nevertheless, the evidence gathered was enough to warrant a charge of first-degree murder. News of Brandon's arrest quickly spread across the University of Mississippi campus. Students and faculty were shocked that one of their peers could have been involved in such a brutal crime. Many of those who knew Brandon described him as a reserved person, but no one suggested that he was capable of murder. Interpersonal relationships and violence prevention discussions began to take place on campus. Students gathered at memorial events in Ali's memory, discussing the kindness and brightness she brought to their lives. The university also stated its intention to cooperate with the police in the investigation of the case and offered support to her family. After Brandon's arrest, the case moved quickly toward a conclusion. The body of evidence, from digital evidence to physical traces and motive for the crime, strongly pointed to his involvement. His behavior, witness statements, and the evidence found formed a picture of a murder that was believed to have been committed out of fear of responsibility for their complicated relationship. Brandon Thiesfeld's trial began in the fall of 2021 in the Circuit Court of Lafayette County, Mississippi. The case immediately drew national attention. The murder of a young female student in a quiet college town shocked everyone who followed the investigation. The prosecution, which collected a large amount of evidence, and the defense, trying to mitigate the guilt of the defendant, entered into a confrontation for justice. The prosecution insisted that Brandon's actions were not only premeditated but also carefully planned. Prosecutors presented the court with a sequence of events based on data collected from Ali's device and possessing physical evidence found at the crime scene. Ali's phone and watch recorded a route that began on campus and ended at Sardy Lake, where she met Brandon. Surveillance cameras on the road confirmed that his vehicle was in the area that night. Data from Brandon's vehicle and footprints left at the scene also played a key role. The tires of his pickup truck matched the prints found on the dirt road, and traces of blood were found in the vehicle, which, according to DNA testing, belonged to Ali. All of this strengthened the prosecution's argument that Brandon was not only at the crime scene, but participated in the murder. Of particular importance was that Brandon's browser history showed his requests for ballistics testing and ways to conceal weapons. Prosecutors said this data indicated that his actions were premeditated and an attempt to prepare to commit a crime. The prosecution insisted that the murder of Ali Castro was premeditated. Among the evidence presented to the court, a letter found in Brandon's apartment after his arrest drew particular attention. This letter, written over the weekend that coincided with the murder, contained the Feld's disturbing musings. In it, he confessed, "I have always had terrible thoughts. These thoughts were fueled by cocaine and alcohol." He continued, "I think this is the end for me. I'm either going to jail or I'm going to die." Prosecutors emphasized that these lines show Brandon's internal conflict, his awareness of what he had done, and his lack of attempt to prevent the tragedy. The letter, along with other evidence including digital data, ballistics testing, and evidence found in his car, formed a powerful prosecution line. The evidence that Brandon, after continuing to ignore Allie's messages, suddenly invited her to a late-night meeting at a quiet, low-traffic lakeside location only confirms the letters describe zeal for violence and the elimination of a difficult relationship by radical means. Brandon's defense tried to change the nature of the charges, arguing that the murder was not premeditated, but was the result of a sudden conflict. The defense attorneys insisted that there was an altercation between the defendant and the victim that escalated into a tragedy. They argued that Brandon did not plan the murder, but acted on impulse. In an attempt to mitigate their client's guilt, the defense tried to cast doubt on some of the evidence. They stated that the footprints at the crime scene could have been left by other people, as the lake is a popular vacation spot. In addition, the attorneys argued that Brandon's behavior after the murder showed panic rather than an attempt to cover up his actions. However, these arguments were not convincing enough for the jury, as the prosecution presented strong evidence backed by expert testimony. The trial hearings were accompanied by numerous witness testimonies. Allie's close friends testified about her anxiety prior to meeting Brandon. They confirmed that the girl had discussed with him an important issue that concerned their relationship. This testimony was key to supporting the prosecution's case that the motive for the crime was an attempt to avoid responsibility for a possible pregnancy. On Brandon's side, witnesses were also called who described him as a withdrawn and secretive person. His acquaintances recalled that he was particularly nervous and aloof in the days before the murder. This behavior was consistent with the theory that Brandon was thinking about his actions beforehand. As the case drew to a close, Brandon unexpectedly agreed to a plea bargain with prosecutors. By pleading guilty to second-degree murder, he avoided the more severe charge of first-degree murder, which could have carried the death penalty. At the hearing, he expressed remorse for what he had done and apologized to Allie's family, but his words failed to elicit sympathy. Allie's mother stated, "No words will bring our daughter back. All we want is justice." On August 27, 2021, the judge handed down the sentence that was the end of a long and arduous trial: life in prison without parole. Allie's family expressed relief upon hearing the verdict, but emphasized that their loss is irreplaceable. Allie's father stated, "We have lost our daughter, but at least we know that the person responsible will no longer be able to hurt others." In his closing remarks, the judge said that this crime was a blatant example of how personal irresponsibility and fear of consequences can lead to irreversible tragedies. He expressed his condolences to the Costello family and added that this case should be a lesson to society. Catherine Wells Burr was born on April 17, 1989, in a small village near Shard, Somerset County, United Kingdom. Her parents, Jay and Philippa Wells Burr, were an ordinary British family committed to traditional values. Jay worked in retail and Philippa worked in accounting. They were humble people who saw in their only daughter not only joy, but also the meaning of their lives. From childhood, Catherine showed herself as a versatile child. She loved to draw, was fond of math, and loved to read books about how different systems, from economics to management. Her parents were always supportive of her hobbies, encouraging her to develop in the areas she was interested in. "We always knew Catherine would succeed because she had a great desire to learn and help others," her parents later told reporters. Catherine attended a local school and stood out among her peers not only for her excellent grades, but also for her kind character. She was a favorite of her teachers, and her classmates respected her for her hard work and willingness to help. Her mentors saw her as a future leader, able not only to achieve personal success, but also to inspire others. She was class president and actively participated in school life, volunteering, and even organizing charity events. One of her favorite subjects was math. Her ability to analyze and find non-standard solutions to problems soon became her calling card. Her parents supported her passion for learning and helped her find additional resources for development. She always said she wanted to work for a big company and be an important person. She had a real gift for management. After leaving school, Catherine went to university to study business administration. It was a conscious and carefully considered decision. She chose a direction that combined her love of analysis with her desire to organize processes. Catherine's student life was busy and interesting. She was actively involved in university projects, helped organize events, and even worked on small initiatives within local businesses. Her thesis was on the topic of business process optimization, and it received high praise from both professors and representatives of local businesses who were invited to the defense. The university years were also a time when Catherine strengthened her personality traits. She learned to be more determined, organized, and resilient. Many friends remembered her as someone who always made time to support and help others despite her own busyness. After successfully graduating, Catherine received a job offer from Pneumatic International, a company that specialized in industrial equipment manufacturing. She began her career as a strategic planning analyst. Her tasks included analyzing data, forecasting company revenue, and developing plans to improve manufacturing processes. Catherine quickly established herself as a forward-thinking employee. Her superiors admired her ability to find solutions to complex problems and her professionalism. She often took the initiative and came up with ideas that helped the company grow. Management soon began considering her for promotion. In 2010, at the age of 21, Catherine met Rafał Nowak at work. Rafał, a 31-year-old Polish immigrant, had been living in the UK for several years and was working as a handyman. Catherine's first impression of Rafał was positive. He seemed mature, attentive, and caring. He could speak beautifully and showed interest in her life. Rafał was born in Poland and came to the UK in search of a better life. He worked hard, but his ambitions were not limited to earning money. He dreamed of financial stability and independence, which resonated with Catherine, who valued people with ambition. Their relationship developed rapidly. In a few weeks after the first date, Rafał began to visit the house of Catherine's parents. He was able to impress them as well, showing himself to be a caring and responsible man. Despite the difference in background and education, their relationship seemed harmonious. In 2011, a year after the beginning of the relationship, Catherine offered Rafał to move in with her. By this time, she had already bought a small house with the help of a mortgage, which was the first step to her financial independence. Living together seemed like the logical next step in their relationship. Rafał was happy about the proposal, but it would later become known that he still had ties with his former partner, Anna Lagwanowicz, which he carefully concealed. Catherine believed that their relationship had a future. She told her friends that she saw Rafał as her future husband. She dreamed of a family and hoped that they could build happiness together. However, she had no idea that behind her back, Rafał and Anna were making their own plans. Catherine Wells Burr was a woman of great promise. Her life seemed outwardly perfect: successful career, home, relationships. However, dark forces lurked behind this picture. In the early hours of September 12, 2012, a farmer living on the outskirts of Chard in Somerset was walking around his land when he noticed a thick cloud of black smoke rising close to the road. As he got closer, he found a car engulfed in flames and immediately called emergency services. Firefighters and police arrived on the scene at 6:30. After extinguishing the fire, human remains were found inside the charred car, located in the back seat. It was immediately obvious that this was not an accident. The charred cloths and papers around the body were probably used to accelerate the fire. The car was in a secluded location away from the main road. There was no damage to the body that would indicate an accident, and the doors were locked. The evidence at the scene clearly indicated that the fire was deliberate. The vehicle's registration number pointed to its owner, Catherine Wells Burr. The 23-year-old, according to her parents, had not spent the night at home, which was highly unusual for her. Later, it turned out that the remains found in the car really belonged to Catherine. Of particular interest to investigators was the fact that at the time of the discovery of the body, Catherine was dressed in home clothes, indicating that she may have been taken by surprise and may not have intended to leave the house voluntarily. Investigators immediately noted several details that indicated a well-planned crime. The location of the car was chosen to minimize the likelihood of detection. Catherine herself could not have been there by accident, given that her clothing indicated that she was probably at home when events began to unfold. In addition, Catherine's personal belongings such as her wallet, keys, and phone were missing. This reinforced investigators' suspicions that the perpetrator was trying to destroy any evidence linking him to the victim. The lack of signs of a struggle at the scene also suggested that the killer was probably familiar with Catherine. She may have trusted him enough to voluntarily go to the door or let him into the house. Forensic analysis provided another important detail. Catherine's body was dead even before the fire started, which completely ruled out the version of accident or suicide. The cause of death was asphyxiation. This indicated that the killer most likely planned the crime in advance to cover his tracks and make it difficult to identify the body. After the first hours at the crime scene, the investigation began to form possible versions of what happened. Due to the circumstances of Catherine Wells Burr's death, the lack of obvious witnesses, and the attempt to thoroughly cover their tracks, the investigation immediately took on a complex character. Police officers realized that before them was a premeditated murder and began to put forward hypotheses that could explain the tragic events. In the first minutes after the discovery of the car, one hypothesis was that the fire could have been the result of an accidental ignition. It could have been a technical fault, such as an overheated engine or a short circuit in the car's wiring. This version was considered particularly carefully, given that the car itself was in working order before Catherine's disappearance. However, several details at the scene led investigators to reject this theory. First, charred remnants of cloth and paper were found inside the car, which could have been used to accelerate the fire. Second, the very nature of the car fire did not fit the usual signs of an accidental fire. The fire spread too quickly and engulfed the car completely, indicating the use of combustible materials. These expert findings led the police to believe that the fire was set intentionally. Another theory was robbery followed by murder. Investigators considered the possibility that Catherine could have been the victim of a random attack. She may have encountered a criminal who decided to take possession of her car or valuables and then, to cover his tracks, killed her and set the car on fire. However, the absence of obvious signs of a struggle at the scene cast doubt on this hypothesis. Catherine's belongings were indeed gone. Her wallet, phone, and keys were not found in the car or nearby. Nevertheless, the MO of the crime indicated more careful planning than is usual in spontaneous robberies. In addition, Catherine's personal clothing was not consistent with the usual circumstances of the attacks. She was probably not going anywhere that evening. The evidence gathered at the crime scene increasingly indicated that the killer was familiar with Catherine and perhaps even close to her. The fact that the victim was wearing home clothes indicated that she was probably at home when she was taken by surprise. It could have been someone she trusted and could have let into the house or agreed to meet without suspicion. In addition, the thoroughness with which the perpetrator tried to cover his tracks indicated a high level of preparation. This was not the work of a random person. Police also took into account the lack of signs of forced entry into Catherine's home, which reinforced suspicions about the possible involvement of a loved one. During the investigation, police uncovered an important detail that put a new twist on the case. Analysis of Catherine's email correspondence and her computer data showed that someone was creating fake accounts on dating sites on her behalf. These profiles contained photos of Catherine pulled from her social media accounts and were used to communicate with other men. Investigators determined that these accounts were not created by Catherine herself. Moreover, the messages sent from them were deliberately provocative to create the illusion of her cheating. The question arose as to who and why he needed to create such profiles. The attacker was trying to provoke the situation to cause jealousy, or to get a pretext for accusations against Catherine for some selfish purposes. After examining the crime scene, investigators began to analyze Catherine's environment. The first thing they focused on was her personal life. Catherine had recently told her parents and friends about her relationship with her boyfriend, 31-year-old Rafael Nowak, with whom she had been living for the past 2 years. Their relationship, according to her loved ones, was not always smooth. Raffle was jealous and sometimes showed secrecy, which caused concern to Catherine's parents. What's more, police learned that Raffle had a relationship with a former partner, 32-year-old Anna Lagwinowicz, that Catherine probably didn't even realize. That relationship turned out to be an important part of the investigation. Investigators began looking at phone records and bank transactions to gather more information about their interactions. Forensic analysis determined that Catherine was strangled during the night while in her home. Features of the inflicted injuries on the face and neck indicated the use of a soft object, presumably a pillow. At the time of her death, the girl was wearing home clothes, confirming that she was most likely in her bedroom when she was attacked. Police turned their attention to Raffle Nowak, but he had an ironclad alibi. He was at his workplace in the morning, as confirmed by security cameras and co-workers. If Raffle strangled Catherine during the night, why didn't he dispose of the body immediately? The initial picture didn't fit. Why did Raffle wait until morning before going to work? Perhaps the murder had taken place in the morning, after the man had left the house. Then someone had taken Catherine's body into a field and burned it in a car. This seemed to rule out his direct involvement in the murder, since he was at work when the car was set on fire. But it raised a new question. If he really couldn't have been the perpetrator, then who killed Catherine? Further investigation focused on Anna Lagwinowicz. Phone records show that in the morning, right after Raffle left for work, Anna called her uncle, Tadeusz Dimitrisin, several times. Surveillance cameras recorded Anna's car in the vicinity of Catherine's house in the early morning hours. This gave investigators reason to believe that it was Anna and Tadeusz who played a key role in getting Catherine's body out of the house. Investigators speculated that the murder may have been committed during the night and the operation to dispose of the body began in the morning. Anna and her uncle removed Catherine's body in her own car, heading to a pre-selected location on the outskirts of town. There, using flammable materials, they set the car on fire to destroy evidence and make identification difficult. Text messages between Raffle and Anna during the morning hours drew particular attention of the police. One of them read, "Everything is going according to plan." This hinted at concerted action, although Raffle himself was not physically involved in the process of setting the car on fire. His alibi was elaborate, suggesting that he could have been the organizer of the crime, even if he was not directly on the scene. The capture of the suspects was a carefully planned operation. The first to be arrested was Raffle Nowak at his workplace early in the morning. The police took him by surprise in order to eliminate resistance. Anna Lagwinowicz was detained at her home, where her cell phone and the keys to the car used to remove the body were seized during the search. The last person to be arrested was Tadeusz Dimitrisin, in whose house they found work gloves with traces of flammable substance. All three denied involvement, but surveillance footage, phone records, and evidence found linked them to the crime. Police coordination avoided information leaks and quickly isolated the suspects for further questioning. The first step was the arrest of Anna Lagwinowicz. Surveillance footage of her car near Catherine's house the morning after the murder was the decisive argument for obtaining an arrest warrant. Anna's interrogation began with a review of her phone activity, especially her messages with Raffle. At first, she denied any connection to Catherine's disappearance, claiming that her morning movements were unrelated to the crime. However, when investigators presented evidence of her presence in the area of the burned car, as well as microscopic fibers of fabric found in her car that matched the upholstery of the sofa from Catherine's house, her position changed. Pressed by the evidence, Anna began to testify, though her words confused the case more. She claimed that she had acted on Raffle's threats and feared for her life, but who exactly killed Catherine she didn't know. The next step was the detention of Tadeusz Dimitrisin, Anna's uncle, who investigators believed helped her remove the body and destroy evidence. His fingerprints were found on the trunk lid of Catherine's car, and phone calls between him and Anna confirmed their close interaction in the morning hours after the murder. During questioning, Tadeusz also denied involvement in the murder, claiming he was only helping his niece without knowing there was a body in the trunk. She said it was some personal cargo of hers that needed to be removed urgently, he claimed. But his version seemed untenable. especially after police provided evidence of him buying combustible materials at a gas station near the scene. Cameras captured him along with Anna at the time of that purchase. Despite Rafal's attempts to create an ironclad alibi for himself, the investigators built a chain of evidence linking him to the crime. The main argument was the analysis of phone data. It turned out that a few hours before the murder, he spoke to Anna, instructing her on what to do. Moreover, his correspondence with Anna included messages such as, "You know what to do, it will be finished in the morning," and, already after setting the car on fire, a short message, "Thank you." Rafal's arrest was the culmination of the investigation. When questioned, he denied guilt, claiming he didn't know what was going on while he was at work. However, his emotional state and inconsistencies in his testimony gave him away. When asked about his last conversation with Catherine, he was confused about the details and claimed that she was supposedly asleep when he left for work in the morning. Forensic evidence indicating the exact time of Catherine's death shattered this theory. The pattern of interactions between the three suspects began to crumble when investigators began using split tactics in interviews. Anna claimed to have acted under pressure from Rafal, naming him as the mastermind. Tadej, on the other hand, claimed that he had no knowledge of the crime and that the initiative came solely from Anna. Rafal, for his part, continued to insist on his innocence, but in order to avert suspicion, began to accuse Anna of acting independently. This tactic only strengthened the investigation's conviction that he was the main organizer. Under the pressure of the evidence and the realization that her testimony was at odds with Rafal's version, Anna made a partial confession. She said that Rafal had informed her of Catherine's death early in the morning, claiming that it was an accident, and asked her to help dispose of the body. When asked why she agreed, Anna said that she was emotionally dependent on Rafal and could not refuse him. Shortly after the arrest of Rafal Nowak and his alleged accomplices, the investigation revealed that there was a financial motive behind the crime. A few months before the tragedy, Catherine had taken out a $123,000 insurance policy, with Rafal as the beneficiary. This information was one of the key elements in explaining why Rafal might have decided to commit murder. The investigation revealed that Rafal was in a difficult financial situation. His bank accounts showed a meager fortune. He often spent more than he earned and appeared to be trying to live a lifestyle he could not afford. Friends and colleagues said that Rafal liked to show himself as a successful man. Police speculated that Rafal saw Catherine's insurance policy as a chance to solve his financial problems. The amount of insurance could have covered his debts and left him with enough money to start a new life. However, in order to get these funds, he needed Catherine to die, making her death look like an accident. Rafal enlisted his former partner Anna Lagwanowicz and her uncle to carry out the plan. Anna's motives may have been related to her feelings for Rafal, as well as the promise of financial gain. Investigators found that she was also in a difficult financial situation. As for Tadej, he probably agreed to participate for the sake of helping his niece or for monetary reward. Rafal presented the murder as a plan in which his every move was calculated. Having secured his alibi at work, he entrusted the physical removal of the body to Anna and her uncle. Destroying evidence through arson was supposed to ensure that the cause of death could not be determined. However, errors in execution, especially the fingerprints and phone records left behind, ruined this plan. The trial of Rafal Nowak, Anna Lagwanowicz and Tadej Demichison lasted several weeks and became one of the most high-profile court proceedings of the year. All three defendants were tried on charges of murder motivated by self-interest, as well as conspiracy to cover up the traces of the crime. The proceedings in district court received extensive media coverage, and the trial was attended by a large audience, including Catherine's friends and family, who clamored for justice. From the beginning, prosecutors built a consistent prosecution that proved the involvement of all three in the gruesome crime. The prosecution argued that the murder was meticulously planned and carried out with cold-blooded calculation. At the center of the conspiracy was Rafal Nowak, who was originally the sole beneficiary of Catherine's large insurance policy. This fact gave him not only a financial motive for the murder, but also the opportunity to organize everything in such a way that he had an alibi. The forensic investigation established that the murder took place at night, when Catherine was at home, in what she thought was a safe environment. The time of death, as determined by experts, coincided with the moment when no one else was in the house except her and Raffel. Forensic evidence indicated that she was smothered with a pillow, which precluded any noise or struggle that might have attracted the attention of neighbors. After committing the crime, Raffel went to work, deliberately creating an alibi for himself. However, this was not enough for him. For the final disposal of the body, he involved his former partner Anna Lagwinowicz and her uncle Tadeusz Dimitricin. The prosecutor's office emphasized that the actions of each of the accused played a key role. Raffel organized the murder and provided an alibi, while Anna and Tadeusz removed the body and burned the car to cover their tracks. Their actions were deliberate and purposeful, which excludes the possibility that they acted under pressure or out of fear, as the defendants themselves claimed. During the trial, prosecutors presented numerous pieces of evidence. Among them were the telephone records, which became one of the most important elements of the case. Analyzing the communications between Raffel and Anna in the days leading up to the murder demonstrated that they had discussed a plan of action. On the morning after Catherine's body was removed, Raffel sent Anna a text message with a short but emphatic phrase, "Everything is going according to plan." This message became one of the key pieces of evidence of the conspiracy. The surveillance cameras also played an important role. They recorded Anna's car near Catherine's home, and then on the way to the field where the burned car was found. In addition, the prosecutor's office provided evidence of the purchase of the combustible materials used in the arson. Receipts and gas station camera footage showed that Tadeusz was in the car with Anna at the time of that purchase. Forensic experts provided reports confirming that Catherine had been killed before her body was moved. This ruled out the possibility that her death was a fire-related accident, as the defendants initially tried to suggest. In addition, the prosecution lawyers pointed to Raffel's financial situation. His precarious monetary condition showed that he was in a critical financial situation. The insurance policy taken out by Catherine was a chance for him to get out of this situation, but in order to do so, he needed to remove the only obstacle, Catherine herself. The defense, for its part, tried to present the defendants in a different light. Raffel Nowak insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. He claimed that his relationship with Catherine was good, despite some disagreements. According to him, he knew nothing about the actions of Anna and Tadeusz, who he suggested might have acted independently. However, his version was contradicted by phone records that proved his active participation in planning the events. Anna Lagwinowicz claimed that she had been the victim of manipulation by Raffel. She claimed that he threatened her, using her feelings for him to force her to participate in the crime. However, prosecutors pointed to her active role in destroying evidence and colluding with her uncle. Anna was also unable to explain why she did not go to the police if, as she claimed, she feared for her life. Tadeusz Dimitricin maintained a tactic of complete denial. He claimed that he did not know that there was a body in the trunk of the car. According to him, he simply fulfilled his niece's request without asking questions. However, his testimony was also contradicted. His fingerprints were found on the fabrics used for the arson, and surveillance footage clearly showed his involvement in the transportation of the body. In April 2013, all three, Raffel Nowak, Anna Lagwinowicz, and Tadeusz Dimitricin, were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. This meant that they would not be able to apply for parole before the expiration of that term. The judge explained that such a harsh sentence was necessary to emphasize the unacceptability of such actions, as well as to show that justice in such cases would be inevitable. Your actions left no room for doubt. You destroyed a young woman's life in cold blood for selfish ends. This crime demands the harshest punishment, he said. Greeley, a small and cozy town in Colorado, has long been known for its quiet and measured life. In this quiet corner where everyone knew each other, two families, the Garazes and the Nelsons, stood out for their stability and prosperity. Ignacio Garaz, a local police officer, was married to the kind and cheerful Heather. Together they raised a young daughter and seemed the epitome of the perfect family. Ignacio was a man of principles, responsible, hardworking, and dedicated to his work. In the eyes of the neighbors, he was an example of courage and discipline, and Heather was the embodiment of a caring wife and mother. Shauna Nelson, on the other hand, led a more withdrawn life. She was a homemaker, raising 2 children and supporting her husband, Ken Nelson, a Weld County deputy sheriff. At first glance, their marriage was as solid as the Garrowses. To her neighbors, Shauna was the perfect mother, and her husband was a respected deputy sheriff. Behind the facade of her marriage, however, was a deep dissatisfaction. Shauna felt trapped in a routine. Domestic duties and lack of new experiences made her life monotonous. Gradually, frustration grew in her soul, and the desire to break out of the familiar circle became stronger and stronger. The change in Shauna's life began with an unexpected acquaintance with Ignacio Garraus. They met at one of their family and work-related events. Ignacio, charming and confident, immediately caught her attention. Their first conversations were completely innocent, but something more quickly developed between them. Shauna was enchanted by his ease of communication and charisma, and Ignacio probably found in her the passion he lacked in his daily family life. Their friendship soon developed into a romance. Ignacio often stayed late at work, justifying it by the necessity of work. Heather, as a faithful wife, supported him, not asking unnecessary questions. However, as time passed, her smile became less and less sincere, and her eyes often revealed hidden anxiety. Friends noticed that Heather became more withdrawn, but did not pay much attention to it, believing that she was simply tired of the daily routine. The affair remained a secret. Ignacio wasn't going to destroy his family for Shauna, but she was becoming more and more attached to him. Her boring life began to fill with new colors. Shauna believed that Ignacio would sooner or later leave his wife and daughter for her, but the reality turned out to be much more complicated. Events began to develop gradually. Sometimes one wrong step is enough for life to take a different path. In a town where everyone knows each other, sometimes one small spark is enough to ignite a flame. And no one could have guessed that very soon the Garrowses' lives would change forever. A few months into their relationship, Shauna found out she was pregnant. This news turned everything upside down. Ignacio found himself in a difficult situation. His wife Heather soon found out about his infidelity. For her, it was a heavy blow, but she was ready to forgive her husband for the sake of preserving the family. Heather herself was a woman of generosity, but at the same time firm. She put Ignacio in front of a choice, their family or his new connection. Ignacio, feeling guilty in front of his wife and daughter, made the decision to sever his relationship with Shauna. Moreover, he gave up any rights to their future child, thus making the final choice in favor of his family. Shauna perceived this act as a betrayal. Her resentment turned to rage. Ignacio stopped answering her calls and messages, avoided meetings, and Heather tried to restore balance in their family. But for Shauna, it all became a personal grudge she couldn't bear. She began sending threats addressed to both Ignacio and Heather. They were harsh messages filled with emotion, dark and disturbing. Shauna couldn't accept being rejected, and her thoughts became increasingly dark. Despite the tense situation, the Garraus family believed that this difficult period was behind them. They continued to live their lives, trying to forget about the unpleasant situation. Heather believed that her marriage would regain stability, while Ignacio was certain that Shauna would simply disappear from their lives. Over the next few months, her obsession subsided. Shauna gave up trying to contact Ignacio, and her threats stopped pouring in against the unfaithful husband and his wife. Even though she said that no one dared do this to her and that she would get justice, she stopped showing overt aggression. Her recent words were seen as emotional outbursts that would soon subside. The Garraus family could breathe a sigh of relief. After much threatening from the mistress, they had stopped, and now had a long way to go to mend their relationship after her husband's negative experience. The morning of January 23, 2007, began like so many other weekdays in Greeley, Colorado. The employees of the credit cooperative were rushing to their desks, some pouring their first cup of coffee and others doing paperwork. In the parking lot adjacent to the building, employees' cars were lined up in familiar rows. It was an ordinary, unremarkable morning. Heather Garraus, one of the co-op's employees, arrived at work a little early to get ready for the start of the day. She left her car in her usual spot and greeted her co-workers as usual as she made her way into the office. The morning, like the rest of her life, was planned to the last detail. There was nothing to portend trouble. Meanwhile, nearby in the same parking lot was a black car that did not attract attention. Behind its steering wheel sat a barely recognizable black silhouette, whose mind was already gripped with the determination to see it through. He was dressed all in black, his face concealed by a mask that resembled the face of a sinister character, and his hands rested nervously on the steering wheel. This man obviously knew Heather's schedule and was sure that this was the morning his plan would come to fruition. As Heather walked out of the office, perhaps to head to her car for some item or just to take a break, the intruder sensed that his moment had arrived. He opened the car door and calmly stepped outside. At first glance, no one would have noticed the figure in black if not for his strange appearance. A mask hid his face, making the image ominous and hard to recognize. Heather noticed the approaching figure but may not have immediately realized who it was. The black-clad man approached her quickly. His steps were confident. His calculation was cool, no tension felt. Witnesses who were nearby at the time later recalled hearing a loud and commanding voice. "You know why I'm here," said the masked man, calling out to Heather. Those words caused everyone to pay attention to what was happening. At first, Heather might have thought it was some kind of evil joke. But as the masked man got closer, the situation became more and more disturbing. Heather, according to eyewitnesses, tried to step back, as if hoping to avoid contact. However, the intruder was already too close. He demanded that Heather stop and kneel down. The girl initially disobeyed the unknown person's order, but the commanding voice and soon displayed weapon convinced her to comply. The scene in the parking lot looked surreal. People who were just approaching the building or were inside began to notice something amiss. Several people stopped, trying to figure out what was going on. Their stories later added up. The masked man was talking loudly to Heather, his voice sounding harsh and threatening. The denouement came swiftly. One of the witnesses, who was in his car nearby, said that he heard a loud sound like a pop. It later became clear that it was a gunshot. After that, another one. Heather fell to the pavement and the figure in black quickly headed toward the car. The bullets hit the places they were originally intended to hit. The killer was cold and calculating, executing his actions without delay, as if he was not doing it for the first time or replaying these events in his head more than 100 times. The intruder seemed to have thought out his exit in advance. He got behind the wheel of a black car and drove away, leaving the scene. Everything happened so quickly that the witnesses who were in confusion did not have time to react. However, some of them were able to remember details such as the make of the car and the attacker's appearance. When police arrived on the scene, the parking lot in front of the Credit Cooperative in Greeley was cordoned off by a group of officers and witnesses. The scene before the officers looked both tragic and disturbing. The morning light emphasized the contrast between a normal workday and the tragedy that occurred. Heather Garous was lying on the pavement not far from her car. Her motionless body indicated that the medics called to the scene would likely no longer be needed. Police officers scrutinized the scene, trying to record every little detail that could aid in the investigation. The officers noticed that there were no obvious signs of a struggle around Heather's body. This indicated that the attack had occurred quickly and purposefully, with no attempted resistance on her part. This circumstance immediately made them think that the crime had probably been planned in advance. Not far from the body were 2 shell casings. Their location on the ground indicated the accuracy and determination of the assailant. The shell casings were quickly recovered by forensics, who suggested that the weapon had been used at close range, which would corroborate eyewitness accounts of a direct confrontation between Heather and her attacker. Tire prints visible on the soft asphalt of the parking lot drew particular attention. The tire tracks pointed to a vehicle that had abruptly left the scene. Police noted that the car had clearly been in the parking lot for some time prior to the attack and then was quickly started and driven away. These footprints were recorded as physical evidence. In addition, abandoned black gloves were found near the body. They looked as if they had been deliberately left behind or thrown away in a hurry. The gloves were carefully packed into evidence bags for further analysis for DNA or gunpowder residue. Police realized that such small details could be crucial in this case. Witnesses at the scene pointed to a man wearing black clothing and a mask who left the scene immediately after the shots were fired. These statements immediately directed investigators' attention to the description of the assailant. Some eyewitnesses added that the car in which the unknown person fled was black and looked like a family car. One of Heather's co-workers also mentioned that he knew about the strained relationship between her and Shauna Nelson, which gave police their first potential suspect. Every little detail at the crime scene added up to a bigger picture. Police noted that the crime was committed with extraordinary cold-bloodedness and forethought. This led to the conclusion that the attacker had prepared in advance and knew where her victim would be. Despite the obvious signs of planning, Shauna left enough evidence for investigators to begin an active search for the suspect. Investigating the murder of Heather Garros became a task of extreme importance for the Greeley Police Department. Discovered evidence and witness testimony began to line up. The first clues, after interviewing Heather's acquaintances, pointed to a possible perpetrator. Investigators focused their attention on a woman who at the time of the attack was in a state of deep personal conflict with the victim, Shauna Nelson. One of the first clues that led the investigation to the trail was a black car seen by witnesses leaving the parking lot immediately after the attack. The car was described as a family SUV, and its distinctive details such as the shape of the headlights and coloring allowed police to narrow down the search. At the scene, forensic investigators recorded distinct tire tracks that later became key evidence. Investigators matched those prints to a database and determined that the tread pattern matched tires used on SUVs, one of which belonged to Weld County Sheriff's Deputy Ken Nelson. Ken's co-workers mentioned that his vehicle was not in the garage that day, but was used for personal use, which confirmed police suspicions. However, all of this was just the beginning. More data was needed to prove Shauna's involvement. While examining the crime scene, police noticed several items left behind by the attacker. Near Heather's body, black gloves were found, which investigators assumed were used to cover her tracks. These gloves, when carefully packaged and sent to the lab, yielded the first concrete evidence. Microscopic traces of DNA, including sweat and skin fragments, were found on the inside of the material, which made it possible to identify the wearer. Another important find was a mask resembling the face of a reaper. This was a key element of the description provided by witnesses who saw a woman wearing black clothing. The mask, later discovered in Ken's car, was one of the most striking pieces of evidence. Forensics showed that the inside of the mask retained traces of sweat that belonged to Shauna Nelson. This confirmed that the mask had been used during the attack. Near the body of Heather Garros, police officers found several clear shoe prints. The footprints indicated that the attacker stood close to her victim and the attack was carried out quickly. These prints were later matched to the shoes found in Ken Nelson's vehicle. Forensics found microparticles of gunpowder on the soles of the shoes, indicating that these shoes were worn at the time of the shooting. As for the weapon, it was not found at the crime scene, but this did not become an obstacle for the investigation. Ballistics testing performed on the shell casings found near Heather's body showed that a gun of a specific model was used, which appeared to be registered to Ken Nelson. This added another element to the chain of evidence against Shauna, as the gun was in the possession of her family. In parallel with the analysis of physical evidence, investigators carefully interviewed witnesses who were in the parking lot at the time of the attack. Several people confirmed that they had seen a woman wearing black clothing and a mask. Her appearance drew attention because it was too unusual for a normal work morning. Witnesses noted that the assailant moved quickly and decisively, indicating that she was confident in her actions. One of Heather's co-workers at the scene recalled that the woman's voice sounded familiar to him. This observation heightened suspicion of Shauna, as she had repeatedly made threats against Heather. Particularly valuable was the testimony of an employee who spotted Ken Nelson's black car near the co-op shortly before the attack. This testimony added another piece to the puzzle the investigation was putting together. Police also began looking into Shauna Nelson's behavior in the previous weeks and months. Her numerous threats against Heather, which she had sent in text messages and expressed in private conversations, were revealed. These threats, according to people who knew her, became increasingly dark and specific. Shauna openly stated that the destruction of her life should have consequences for others. Her relationship with Ignacio Garros, which was the cause of the conflict, was also addressed as part of the investigation. Ignacio confirmed that after their relationship broke down, Shauna started behaving erratically, sending him texts and calls, threatening to destroy his family. All of this created the image of a person driven by rage and a thirst for revenge. By the end of the first 24 hours of the investigation, the police already had an impressive body of evidence against Shauna Nelson. Evidence collected at the crime scene, including gloves, a mask, shoe prints, and tire tracks, was matched to Ken Nelson's car and Shauna's behavior. DNA testing confirmed her direct link to the physical evidence found at the crime scene. Witness testimony added additional layers to the crime picture, confirming that Shauna may have been the one on the scene at the time of the attack. Her characteristic threats, prior behavior, and access to her husband's car and weapon were crucial factors in shaping the prosecution's case. Every detail added up to a cohesive picture. Shauna Nelson planned the attack in advance, used her husband's car and property to commit the crime, and left enough traces that pointed to her involvement. At this point, the investigation was ready to take the next step, arresting the suspect and charging her. Based on the evidence and witness testimony gathered, Greeley police made the decision to apprehend Shauna Nelson, who by then had already become the prime suspect in the Heather Garrows murder case. The investigation was meticulously prepared for the arrest to avoid mistakes and ensure the legal integrity of the action. Officers realized that enough evidence had already been accumulated against Shauna to bring charges against her, but each next step required precision and coherence. Police officers used the first 24 hours after the crime to covertly observe Shauna. She was at home in suburban Greeley with her husband Ken and children. According to the officers who observed her, Shauna was acting nervous but trying to maintain an outwardly calm demeanor. Her demeanor showed no signs of remorse, but police had no doubt that she was aware of the inevitability of exposure. The officers turned their attention to Ken Nelson's car, which was parked outside the house. It was the same black SUV that witnesses had seen leaving the scene. Forensics had already gathered enough evidence to link that vehicle to the attack. Police decided not to seize the vehicle immediately so as not to alert the suspect. Instead, it was decided to wait for the right time to make an arrest. The next day, after completing their analysis of the evidence collected, investigators obtained court warrants to search the Nelson home and arrest Shauna. The importance of this step was obvious. Any item seized could become additional evidence in the case. The warrant allowed police officers to seize clothing, shoes, and other personal items that could have been used at the time of the crime. In the early morning hours of January 25, 2007, a group of officers went to the Nelson home. They arrived without sirens on to avoid attracting the attention of neighbors and to give Shauna less time for possible resistance or destruction of evidence. Police carefully considered their actions, given that Ken Nelson, the suspect's husband, was a sheriff's deputy and could have tried to intervene. When the officers knocked on the door, Ken opened it for them. He was surprised and clearly alarmed by their visit. The officers explained that they had a search and arrest warrant and asked Shauna to leave the house. She emerged a few minutes later, looking outwardly calm but with a noticeable tension in her face. Her voice was steady when she asked what she was accused of, but the investigators noticed her trembling hands. "Mrs. Nelson, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Heather Garrows," one of the officers announced. Shauna listened to these words in silence, neither protesting nor expressing surprise. This calmness may have been due to the realization that events were unfolding inevitably. The police officers handcuffed her and escorted her to the patrol car. Ken stood on the doorstep, taking no action, but his face expressed shock. He would later become a key witness in the trial, providing testimony that would help strengthen the case against Shauna. While Shauna was being taken to the station, another team of officers began a search of the Nelson home. The first thing that caught their attention was Shauna's personal belongings that could be connected to the crime. Black clothing and shoes similar to witnesses' descriptions were found in a closet. Also in one of the drawers, police found text messages that Shauna had saved on an old cell phone. These messages contained threats against Heather and were an important addition to the evidence. In addition, Ken's black SUV was found in the garage and was immediately seized for further analysis. Inside the vehicle was a mask, which witnesses described as part of the assailant's outfit. Forensics collected samples of biological material on the seats and steering wheel, which later confirmed that Shauna had been driving the car on the day of the murder. After her arrest, Shauna was taken to the police station for questioning. Investigators gave her an opportunity to give an explanation, but she refused to answer questions without a lawyer present. Her silence, however, only strengthened the investigators' confidence in her involvement. Meanwhile, the analysis of the collected evidence continued. During the interrogation, investigators tried to ask Shauna questions about her relationships with Heather Garrows and Ignacio Garrows, but she avoided direct answers. One officer noticed that despite her calm demeanor, Shauna kept avoiding eye contact, which betrayed her tension. The lawyer she later hired built his defense on denying Shauna's involvement in the crime, but the investigation already had a strong evidentiary basis. All the materials collected, tire tracks, DNA found on the mask and gloves, witness statements, and threats documented in reports, indicated that the crime had been carefully planned. On the day of the arrest, police made final preparations to formally charge Shauna. Investigators were confident they had everything they needed to secure a conviction in court. After Shauna Nelson's arrest, preparations began for a trial that promised to be high-profile and complex. The case drew attention not only from Greeley residents, but from across the country. Details of the tragedy involving a love triangle, adultery, and murder excited the public. The trial was to set all the dots over and determine whether Shauna was really responsible for the death of Heather Garros. The Weld County Prosecutor's Office built the prosecution case on carefully gathered evidence and testimony. The case was based on DNA evidence, tire prints, threats made to Heather and Ignacio, and eyewitness testimony. Prosecutors argued that the murder was planned in advance and the evidence pointed to Shauna's direct involvement. Shauna's defense attempted to challenge the charges, arguing that the evidence presented was not conclusive. The defense attorneys argued that another person could have been involved in the crime scene and their client was subjected to a biased investigation because of her relationship with Ignacio Garros. They also emphasized the lack of direct witnesses who could confirm that Shauna was the one who shot Heather. The trial began in early 2008. The first week was devoted to selecting a jury, which had to be unbiased despite widespread public interest in the case. Prosecutors, in their opening statement, described the chain of events leading up to the murder. They emphasized that Shauna could not accept the breakdown of her relationship with Ignacio, leading her to take desperate action. The defense began its line of argument with claims of insufficient evidence, focusing on the circumstantial nature of the evidence. The defense attorneys argued that there were gaps in the case that made it impossible to say with certainty that Shauna was guilty. The testimony was an important part of the trial. Heather Garros's co-workers recalled that in recent months she had often talked about threats from Shauna. Some of the witnesses saw a woman wearing black clothing and a mask on the day of the murder. One of them said he heard her voice, which he later identified as Shauna's. Ignacio Garros was subpoenaed and testified at length about his relationship with Shauna. He confirmed that after the breakup she began threatening both him and his wife. Ignacio read portions of the messages Shauna had sent him in the weeks before the tragedy, including phrases indicating her intent to seek revenge. One of the crucial moments of the trial was the presentation of physical evidence. Prosecutors displayed a mask, gloves, shoes, and threatening recordings found in Ken Nelson's car. Experts who appeared in court confirmed that the DNA found on these items belonged to Shauna. The results of the analysis of the car's tires, which matched the marks at the crime scene, were also shown. Crime scene photographs, notes of witness testimony, and copies of Shauna's messages were shown to the jury. These materials left a strong impression on the court, emphasizing the connection between the suspect and what happened. Shauna Nelson refused to testify in her own defense. Her attorneys insisted that the investigation may have missed other suspects by focusing solely on Shauna because of her previous threats. They tried to undermine the credibility of the DNA test results by claiming possible contamination of the samples, but forensic experts convincingly refuted those claims. The defense also focused on Shauna's emotional state, arguing that her threats were just words and not real intentions. But the array of evidence and testimony presented left little chance of success for this strategy. In January 2008, after weeks of hearings and 3 days of deliberations, the jury unanimously found Shauna Nelson guilty of first-degree murder. The judge announced the sentence, life in prison without parole. The verdict brought relief to the family of Heather Garros, who attended the verdict announcement. Shauna remained outwardly calm upon hearing the verdict, but her intense gaze betrayed the realization that her life was forever changed. Her husband, Ken Nelson, who was also in the courtroom, looked distressed but made no attempt to support his wife. The trial and sentencing of Shauna Nelson was the outcome of a tragedy caused by jealousy and anger. The case will long be remembered by Greeley residents as a reminder of the devastating effects of unbridled emotion. Shauna continues to serve her sentence in a correctional facility, and Heather Garros' family is trying to rebuild their lives after the horror she endured. Robin Baxter was born on March 8, 1957, in New Albany, Indiana. She grew up in a large, close-knit family where love and understanding reigned. Robin's parents, Thomas and Marion Harper, raised 4 children, instilling in them the values of honesty, hard work, and kindness. From childhood, Robin was characterized by her openness and cheerfulness. She made friends easily, was inquisitive, and genuinely interested in people. At school, Robin showed an aptitude for the humanities, especially she liked literature and history. Teachers noted her analytical mind and ability to think deeply. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in community college, where she chose to major in social work. Robin dreamed of helping people in difficult situations and saw it as her calling. After graduating from college with honors, Robin got a job in Child Protective Services. She was not just a specialist performing duties, but a person who genuinely cared about the fate of her charges. Her colleagues recalled how she tried to do more than her job required. She brought holiday gifts to children from disadvantaged families, helped parents find a way out of difficult situations. Robin quickly became an indispensable employee, and more successfully resolved cases were added to her portfolio. As time went on, Robin considered further training and enrolled in an evening master's program at university to further her knowledge of psychology. However, these plans had to be put on hold after marriage and the birth of her children. Robin met Christopher Baxter in 1981 through mutual friends. He gave the impression of an ambitious and charismatic man. Christopher worked as a mechanic in a car service, was a jack of all trades and able to charm others. Their romance developed rapidly, and a year later they played a wedding. In 1983, the couple had their first daughter, Emma, and 2 years later a son, Jason, was born. Robin adored her children, putting all her efforts in their upbringing. Despite the fact that she temporarily left her job, Robin tried to stay active, participating in school activities and helping neighbors. The Baxter family looked exemplary. They had a cozy house with a small lawn, 2 healthy children, and a steady income. However, behind the facade of prosperity lurked cracks. Christopher, with his hot temper, was often the cause of family conflicts. Robin tried to smooth things over, but loved ones knew that their marriage was far from ideal. Over time, Robin and Christopher's relationship began to show tension. Family friends noticed that Christopher was becoming increasingly irritable and withdrawn. He would get angry over the smallest things and sometimes use harsh words toward his wife. Robin didn't share her worries, but sometimes her friends could see the tiredness and worry in her eyes. Christopher appeared to be jealous of Robin's success and social acceptance. She was the favorite of all who interacted with her, while he remained in the shadows, tending to his mechanic's shop. Financial difficulties only exacerbated the situation. In rare moments of honesty, Robin shared with her sister that she feared for her children's future, though she tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. In the final weeks before Robin's disappearance, friends noticed that she had become pensive and depressed. Usually active and energetic, she began to avoid socializing and was less likely to show up at her friends' meetings. A co-worker with whom Robin had maintained a friendly relationship recalled her telling him on the day of her disappearance, "I feel like I'm at a crossroads, and I don't know what to do next." This phrase, uttered with a bitter smile, later sounded particularly disturbing. The evening of July 19, 1990, in the small town of New Albany, Indiana, was seemingly quite ordinary. Robin Lynn Baxter, a 32-year-old wife and mother of 2, had spent the day doing housework and preparing dinner for her family. Her home on Troy Street was a cozy haven where she lived with her husband, Christopher. Robin was known as a friendly, active woman, always willing to help her neighbors and get involved in the local community. However, the very next morning, everything changed. Christopher, her husband, reported not finding Robin at home. According to him, they had an argument in the evening, after which Robin left the house and he went to bed, drunk. When he woke up at 3 or 4 a.m., she was still not there. On the morning of July 20, 1990, Christopher Baxter, unable to find his wife Robin at home, began searching for her. After a tense night of searching the streets of New Albany for his wife, his anxiety only grew. He began calling Robin's friends and relatives, hoping that some of them had seen her or knew where she was, he said. However, no one close to him could give him any information. Christopher also went around the neighborhood, looking at places Robin liked to go, but all attempts were fruitless. As the hours wore on, his panic grew worse. He decided to contact the police to formally report her missing. Soon officers, with the support of local residents, began an organized search. The area around the Baxters' home was thoroughly searched, but no trace of Robin was found. The disappearance of a seemingly ordinary woman was the beginning of one of the most mysterious cases in New Albany's history. 2 days after her disappearance, Robin's sister, Charlene Harper, took the initiative. It was she who contacted the New Albany police, stating that Christopher's behavior made her suspicious, and she feared for her sister's life. A search began shortly thereafter. The Baxters' home on Troy Street was the first place the police went to. At first glance, nothing unusual caught the eye: a neat, clean house with a well-kept garden. Inside, however, there were details that raised questions for investigators. A broken back door window indicated some sort of incident. Christopher claimed to have broken it in the heat of an argument with his wife, but this detail, rather than clarifying the situation, added more mysteries. Police found an unfinished dinner on the kitchen table and traces of blood in the sink that Christopher claimed were his own. He claimed he had cut himself while cooking. However, the condition of the house seemed odd for a normal family quarrel. Everything looked too thoroughly cleaned up, as if someone had tried to remove the marks. In the yard and garage, investigators found nothing to indicate Robin's whereabouts. What caught their attention, however, was the absence of one of the items mentioned by family friends. An empty space was found on the garage wall where a massive aluminum bar would normally hang. Police and volunteers began an extensive search for Robin. Wooded areas adjacent to the Troy Street neighborhood were searched, as well as bodies of water and the Ohio River running nearby. Sniffer dogs followed Robin's trail, but it dropped off a few blocks from her home, near a parking lot. For days, a search party of neighbors and volunteers combed every street, looking for any possible leads. Rumors surfaced that Robin might have been the victim of a kidnapping. However, that rumor was never confirmed. As weeks passed, hope of finding her alive began to fade. On July 23, 1990, 4 days after her disappearance, police received a call from a Louisville Police Department patrol boat. A female corpse had been discovered in the water of the Ohio River, about 3 miles from the Baxter home. The body was stuck in snags near the shore. Detectives and crime scene investigators immediately rushed. Upon arrival, police determined that the body belonged to a woman matching Robin Baxter's description. She was wearing a black t-shirt but was naked below the waist. Forensic investigators noticed bruising on the woman's neck that resembled signs of a struggle, but that was not the primary cause of death. Forensics examined the body at the scene, but due to its condition caused by being in the water, it was decided to conduct an autopsy. Initially, investigators were unable to determine if Robin died before being in the water or if it was a crime cover-up. The only clear sign of violent death was a massive bruise on the back of her head, raising suspicions of a blow from a heavy object. During the forensic autopsy, it was determined that the cause of death was blunt trauma to the head. The contusion was inflicted with such force that it caused extensive hemorrhaging. Investigators concluded that the woman was likely killed before her body was in the water. Despite initial concerns, no signs of sexual assault were found. The details established by forensics only added to the mystery. In particular, forensic experts suggested that the crime weapon may have been a metal object about 3 feet long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter. This detail would later play a key role in identifying the perpetrator. At this point, investigators had already begun to suspect that Robin was the victim of a premeditated crime. However, there was not enough evidence to directly identify the killer. The investigation focused on Robin's inner circle, especially her husband, Christopher. Nevertheless, the investigators were in no hurry to draw conclusions. realizing that one wrong move could ruin the case. They were looking for additional evidence that would allow them to build a coherent theory. The discovery of Robin Baxter's body in the Ohio River launched a wave of theories among both police and the public. Investigators had no doubt that the woman's death was the result of a violent crime. In the first weeks after the tragedy, however, evidence to charge her was woefully lacking. New Albany detectives scrutinized Robin's life, habits, and surroundings to see who might have wanted to harm her. The first hypothesis investigators considered was that Robin may have been the victim of a random attack after she left home on the evening of July 19 and 1908. According to Christopher Baxter's account, she left the house after their argument and had not been seen since. Detectives speculated that the woman may have encountered an unknown criminal on the street or been kidnapped. This theory had a certain logic. The Troy Street area was relatively quiet, but nearby were busier areas with bars and stores where Robin could accidentally cross paths with someone aggressive or intoxicated. Robin herself was known to be friendly and outgoing, which could have attracted the attention of an intruder. However, police found no witnesses to confirm that Robin had even left her neighborhood that evening. No neighbors who were on the street saw her leave. There were no surveillance cameras that could have recorded her movement. Moreover, the place where the body was found was too far away for Robin to walk there on her own. The lack of obvious signs of a struggle in the street further undermined this theory. In the end, it was never pursued. The second version turned out to be more plausible. Already in the first days after Robin's disappearance, detectives began to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband, Christopher. During the first interrogation, he looked tired and nervous, and his account of the events of the evening of July 19 was full of contradictions. Christopher claimed that he went to bed after the argument and then woke up around 3 a.m. and went to look for his wife. However, none of the neighbors confirmed seeing him outside at that time. Further conversations with Robin's friends and relatives only heightened police suspicions. They revealed that there were frequent conflicts in the couple's marriage. Some described Christopher as a man with a difficult temper, prone to outbursts of anger. One family friend mentioned that the man was extremely jealous and tried to control all aspects of his wife's life. Ex-mother dubs KFC. Under questioning, Christopher admitted that their arguments sometimes escalated into aggression, but adamantly denied that he had hurt Robin that night. A key element that led investigators to focus on Christopher was the absence in the garage of an aluminum bar he called the equalizer. This item was known to family friends as a self-defense tool that Christopher kept in a prominent place. One witness mentioned that the rod disappeared the same night that Robin disappeared. Despite this, the police faced a major problem: a lack of direct evidence. There was no obvious evidence linking Christopher to where the body was found. There were no fingerprints or DNA traces on Robin's clothing due to the body's prolonged exposure to water. Witnesses could only describe Christopher's character and behavior, but their testimony was circumstantial. Without reliable physical evidence, it was impossible to charge him. By the fall of 1990, the investigation had reached a dead end. All leads were either unsupported by the facts or could not be followed through due to lack of evidence. The police had a prime suspect, but lacked the tools to take the case to trial. As often happens in such cases, the Robin Baxter case was temporarily closed. Years passed. Christopher Baxter continued to live in New Albany, avoiding the public eye. Robin's family never gave up hope that the case would be solved, but with each passing year, their faith in justice waned. The investigation remained in the shadows until an unexpected report was made to the police department in 2012. In February 2012, police received information from an inmate in a state prison. The man, whose name was withheld in the interest of the investigation, stated that Christopher Baxter was his friend and had once confessed to him to killing his wife. According to the informant, Christopher said that on the night of July 20, 1990, he was heavily intoxicated and in a fit of anger hit Robin with a heavy object. He also mentioned that he disposed of the body by throwing it into the river. This testimony breathed new life into an old case. Investigators began to re-examine the evidence collected in 1990 and compare it with the new information. Thanks to improved forensic techniques and data from witness interviews, several key details were confirmed. For example, forensic analysis of the murder weapon described by the informant matched the findings from 1990. In February 2012, Christopher Baxter was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. This event was the culmination of years of suspense for Robin's family and those who had been following this mysterious case. Christopher Baxter's arrest was made possible by carefully collected evidence that, 2 decades later, brought the case back to the attention of investigators. Following a statement from an inmate informant who claimed that Christopher had confessed the murder to him, New Albany police reopened the case and began cross-checking all available evidence. This was not an easy task. Many of the 1,990 witnesses no longer lived in the city. The evidence was eroded by time, and the circumstances of the case required in-depth analysis. After obtaining a statement from the prisoner, police turned to old witnesses in an attempt to reconstruct the chronology of events and uncover additional details. One key issue was the disappearance of an aluminum bar known as the equalizer from the Baxters' garage. The item had already aroused suspicion in 1990, but at that time it could not be proven to be connected to the murder. In 2012, with new forensic technology and an informant's testimony, detectives suggested that the equalizer may have been the murder weapon that delivered the fatal blow to the back of Robin's head. One of Christopher's old friends, who had been in contact with him since his wife's disappearance, said Christopher was strangely calm after the tragedy. He said Christopher once admitted to feeling relieved, although he did not specify what he meant. Another witness reported that in 1991, a year after the murder, Christopher said in a drunken conversation, "You never know what it's like to take someone's life until you do it yourself." Those words didn't cause the listener much concern at the time, but in light of the new circumstances, they have taken on weight. In February 2012, police obtained an arrest warrant for Christopher Baxter. At the time, he was 54 years old, living in a modest apartment on Slate Run Road, still in New Albany. In the years since the murder, he had led a secluded lifestyle, rarely had contact with neighbors, and preferred to remain in the shadows. Neighbors described him as a taciturn and withdrawn man who seemed to avoid any mention of his past life. When the police arrived at his home, Christopher offered no resistance. He opened the door and calmly listened to being charged with his wife's murder. "I knew this day would come," he allegedly told one of the officers. That moment was the beginning of a long-awaited advance in a case that seemed hopeless. During his first interrogation, Christopher denied any involvement in the murder. His version of events remained the same as in 1990. He claimed that after an argument with Robin, he went to bed, and when he woke up at 3 or 4 a.m., he found that she was not at home. He repeated that he looked for his wife on the street and called her friends and relatives, but found nothing. However, there were still numerous contradictions in Christopher's testimony. First, none of the neighbors had seen him on the street at night, even though it was well lit and usually quite busy. Second, his explanations for the broken window on the back door sounded illogical. Christopher claimed to have broken it during an argument, but could not explain why he did not try to fix it immediately after the incident. These minor inconsistencies led investigators to question his word. When detectives asked about the equalizer, Christopher refused to answer questions, citing a lack of memory of that evening. This response only heightened suspicion. Christopher was also unable to explain why he made the strange statements mentioned by his friends in 1991 and why his behavior after Robin's disappearance was so strange. The key evidence against Christopher was the testimony of witnesses, the testimony of an inmate informant, and circumstantial physical evidence found in the house. Although Robin's body was discovered days after the murder and most of the evidence had been destroyed by water, experts were able to confirm that the injury to Robin's head was entirely consistent with the characteristics of a blow that could have been inflicted by the equalizer. This match added significant weight to the case against Christopher. Forensic scientists also reviewed the blood tests found in the Baxters' home in 1990. Although technology at the time did not allow for precise DNA identification, experts concluded that the blood was human and could have belonged to Robin. The totality of this evidence, while not conclusive, convinced the investigation that the evidence pointed specifically to Christopher. One of the most powerful factors in the case was the testimony of an inmate who had befriended Christopher in prison. This man said that Christopher, while under the influence of alcohol, confessed to him about killing his wife. He allegedly described how, in a fit of rage, he had struck Robin with a heavy metal object and then disposed of the body by throwing it into the river. These words match details known to police since 1990, but never before publicly disclosed. The informant also provided a description of Christopher's emotional state, which he said was a mixture of pride and fear. These statements were the final link in the chain of evidence. Although it was given by a person in custody, it was supported by other circumstantial evidence and data collected earlier. One of the most powerful factors in the case was the testimony of an inmate who had befriended Christopher in prison. This man said that Christopher, while under the influence of alcohol, confessed to him about killing his wife. He allegedly described how, in a fit of rage, he had struck Robin with a heavy metal object and then disposed of the body by throwing it into the river. These words matched details known to police since 1990, but never before publicly disclosed. The informant also provided a description of Christopher's emotional state, which he said was a mixture of pride and fear. These statements were the final link in the chain of evidence. Although it was given by a person in custody, it was supported by other circumstantial evidence and data collected earlier. After Christopher Baxter's arrest in February 2012, the New Albany Police Department announced the reopening of the Robin Baxter case. This caused a large public outcry. Robin's family and friends, who had waited over 2 decades for justice, finally felt that their efforts had not been in vain. Christopher was charged with second-degree murder. His attorneys immediately began preparing a defense, arguing that the evidence against him was insufficient and that witness testimony was based on memories that were over 20 years old. However, the prosecution remained confident that enough material had been gathered to convict. The trial of Christopher Baxter began in July 2012 and attracted considerable attention from both the public and the media. After more than 20 years of waiting, the case of Robin Baxter's mysterious death finally made its way into the courtroom. For her family and friends, it was a chance to get justice, but for Christopher's defense, it was a battle of wits as they tried to exploit weaknesses in the prosecution's evidence. The prosecution presented a chain of evidence linking Christopher to the murder. A key element of the prosecution's case was the testimony of witnesses, including an inmate informant. He detailed conversations with Christopher in which he confessed to killing his wife, and even mentioned details that could only have been known to the killer and investigators. In addition, family, friends, and acquaintances of the couple described frequent arguments between the couple. Some witnesses described Christopher as a controlling and irascible person, and one of them mentioned that a year before Robin's disappearance, he had heard him say the disturbing phrase, "When I get angry, I lose control. Forensic experts presented analysis confirming that the trauma on Robin's head matched the damage that would have been caused by an aluminum bar known as an equalizer. The absence of this object from the Baxters' garage also heightened suspicion. Although there was no direct evidence that Christopher was the one who delivered the fatal blow, the chain of circumstantial evidence was quite compelling. Christopher Baxter's attorneys built a defense around two key talking points, focusing on the prosecution's evidentiary deficiencies and undermining the credibility of key witnesses. First, the defense focused on the testimony of an inmate informant who became a central figure in the case. The defense lawyers argued that this witness, while in prison, could have deliberately made up or distorted information in order to obtain a reduction of his sentence or other privileges. They emphasized that such motives often led prisoners to give unreliable testimony, and their interest in the outcome of the case made their testimony highly unreliable. In court, the defense repeatedly pointed out that the informant's words must be viewed with extreme caution. Second, the lawyers focused on the fact that the evidence collected in 1990 was incomplete and unreliable due to the limitations of forensic science at the time. They emphasized that the police could not find any DNA or fingerprints linking Christopher to the murder, and most of the evidence was destroyed due to the body's prolonged exposure to water. The defense pointed out that even the blood tests done on the house at the time did not yield conclusive results. Taken together, they argued, this made the prosecution's evidence circumstantial and unconvincing. The defense lawyers insisted that the lack of a direct link between Christopher and the crime left the case at the level of conjecture. On the third day of the hearing, however, the prosecution presented an unexpected argument. The prosecutor's office presented the court with the testimony of Christopher's friend, who gave new testimony. This person, although not previously mentioned, said that he had once seen Christopher jokingly refer to the equalizer as his way of solving problems in the Baxters' garage. The witness noted that Christopher had always kept the item in a prominent place, but that after Robin disappeared, the rod was missing, and Christopher avoided talking about the subject. This testimony, while not decisive, added weight to the prosecution's overall picture. They showed that Christopher knew how to use the equalizer and could easily use it as a weapon. After 5 days of hearings and 3 days of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. Christopher Baxter was found guilty of murdering his wife, Robin Baxter. The judge sentenced him to 55 years in prison, noting in the verdict that the crime was committed with extreme cruelty and premeditation. After the sentencing, Christopher's attorneys appealed, arguing that the case was mishandled and that the judge failed to consider insufficient physical evidence. They also cited old laws from 1990, arguing that Christopher should not have received such a harsh sentence. An appeal hearing in 2014 resulted in the sentence being reduced to 40 years. Despite this, Christopher remained in prison until August 2020, when he was granted parole. He was 62 years old at the time of his release. Rachel Winkler was born in 1977 in California. She grew up in a loving family where her parents instilled in her the values of kindness, honesty, and responsibility. Her childhood was spent in a nurturing environment, and from an early age, she showed kindness and an eagerness to help those around her. At school, Rachel was active and sociable. She easily found common language with people, and her sincerity always attracted friends to her. After school, she chose a path related to business and marketing. After receiving her education, she started working in project management, where she quickly established herself as a reliable and responsible specialist. Despite her successful career, the main priority in Rachel's life has always been her family. She dreamed of a strong marriage, children, and a cozy home. Todd Winkler was born in 1966 in Florida. His family was well off. His father was engaged in business and his mother worked in the field of medicine. From childhood, he grew up in an atmosphere of strict discipline and a high level of requirements. After high school, Todd decided to devote himself to serving in the United States Air Force. He underwent rigorous training and qualified as a combat airplane pilot. Military service shaped him as a person. He became tough, disciplined, and demanding both to himself and to others. After completing his military career, Todd decided to apply his analytical mind in the civilian sphere and went into the pharmaceutical business. His diligence and perseverance helped him to take an executive position in a large pharmaceutical company. But despite his success in business, aviation remained his main passion. He continued to fly, earning his private pilot's license and owning a small plane. Rachel and Todd met in the early 2000s. They met at a social event where they discussed business prospects in California. Rachel, with her charm and gentleness, immediately caught Todd's attention. A spark erupted between them. Todd was charmed by her kindness, ease of communication, and ability to create a warm atmosphere. And Rachel was attracted by his confidence, stability, and strength of character. The romance developed rapidly and soon they were married. In the 2000s, they moved to El Dorado Hills, a prestigious and quiet neighborhood in California, where they could build their future. At first glance, their marriage was perfect. They had 3 children. The house was filled with joy and comfort. Rachel became a wonderful mother, fully devoting herself to the upbringing of children. She supported Todd despite his difficult character. Todd continued to build a career, devoting a lot of time to work. Sometimes he disappeared on business trips, and when he returned, his mood depended on the success on the professional front. He was a demanding husband and father. Discipline, order, and a clear schedule were more important to him than spontaneity and gentleness. Over time, his firmness began to develop into controlling behavior. He expected things to be as strict in the family as they were in the military or in business. Rachel put up with it, hoping things would get better. But by 2011, tensions in their marriage began to mount. Todd became increasingly withdrawn and testy. Sometimes he showed irritation for no apparent reason, controlled his wife's financial spending, and demanded that she obey the family rules. Rachel began to think about divorce. She told her friends that she was tired of the constant tension and wanted to start a new life. At the end of 2011, she made the decision to leave. She started gathering divorce papers and looking for a new place to live. But Todd was not ready to let go of the family so easily. The morning of February 27, 2012, in El Dorado Hills began as usual. Neighbors heard children's voices, some were walking their dogs and others were doing their morning chores. The Winkler house looked quiet. The blinds were open, and the couple's cars were parked in the yard. One of the neighbors, who was working in the garage at the time, heard a loud noise coming from Todd and Rachel's house. There was a thud, then a woman's scream. The man froze for a second, listening, but then everything went quiet. A few minutes passed, but the feeling of unease didn't let him go. He knew there had been trouble in the Winkler household lately, had heard of a pending divorce. Remembering it was better to be safe, the neighbor dialed 911 and reported hearing suspicious noises coming from across the street. When police officers arrived on the scene, they saw Todd Winkler on the doorstep of the house. His hands, clothing, and face were covered in blood, but he was standing calmly, showing no aggression. Todd obeyed without further ado. His gaze was blank. He looked confused, but he didn't resist. The police went inside. In one of the rooms on the floor, they saw Rachel's body. Everything in the house said something terrible had happened. Now the police had to find out how the events unfolded and what exactly caused the tragedy. After police entered the house, they found a disturbing picture of the events that had unfolded there shortly before their arrival. El Dorado Hills was a neighborhood of mostly upper-middle families. Homes here were spacious, with well-maintained yards and modern finishes. The Winkler family home was no exception. A 2-story building with large windows, a cleanly mowed lawn, expensive furniture, and modern appliances inside. But on this day, the house was in chaos. The living room, leading to the staircase to the second floor, looked untouched. But there was a strange metallic odor in the air that the police officers knew well. the smell of blood. Footprints on the floor led deeper into the house, toward the couple's bedroom. As the officers moved down the hallway, they noticed signs of a struggle. One of the paintings hanging on the wall had been knocked off its hook, its glass cracked. There were scattered items on the floor, a table lamp that had been torn off, several pillows that had flown off the couch, and an overturned chair. When they reached the master bedroom, an even more disturbing scene came into view. The master bedroom was spacious, with a large bed in the middle, a window with curtains letting in daylight, and bedside tables. Normally, this room looked well-maintained and cozy, but today it had turned into a crime scene. The floor was stained with blood, some of which had already begun to dry, leaving dark stains on the wooden flooring. The sheet on the bed was crumpled, the blanket sliding to the floor as if someone had ripped it off. There was a half-drunk cup of coffee on the nightstand and a cell phone lying next to it. The police noticed that the screen was cracked and a close button was lying on the floor nearby, a clear sign of a struggle. One of the main items that caught investigators' attention was the murder weapon, scissors. They were not far from Rachel's body. One half of the blade was covered in blood. But the most gruesome find was the body itself. Rachel was lying on the floor in an unnatural pose. One arm was outstretched to the side, and the other was bent at the elbow, as if trying to defend herself. Her blonde hair was tangled, some of it sticking to her face due to blood. There were several wounds on her body, some of which clearly indicated that the blows had been delivered with force. One of the wounds was in the chest area and another was on her neck. Her face was frozen in an expression of horror and her eyes remained open. Officers noticed that she had small skin marks under her fingernails, a possible sign that she had tried to struggle. An investigator was examining the scene, recording details. Police realized that it was now important to gather all the evidence in order to reconstruct a picture of what had happened. In addition to the obvious signs of a struggle, police noticed several important details. There may have been fingerprints left on the scissors and cell phone that could shed light on the events. Rachel's cell phone was damaged, hinting at her attempt to use it during the conflict. Bloody marks on the walls and floor spoke of an intense struggle. The overturned chair and damaged nightstand testified to the chaotic nature of what had happened. Todd's clothes were covered in blood, but he had no visible wounds, indicating his direct involvement in the incident. The police also wondered about possible camera footage or alarm data that could help in reconstructing the chronology of events. Everything said that Rachel had tried to defend herself before her death, and now investigators had to find out the whole truth. Despite the scary picture, Todd behaved calmly. He stood outside the bedroom, watching the officers' actions. The officers watched his demeanor carefully. He did not appear aggressive, but he did not appear distressed. The officers fixed his clothes. There were numerous bloodstains on his shirt and jeans, but no obvious signs of wounds, indicating that the blood belonged to Rachel. His emphatically calm demeanor raised questions. He didn't cry, didn't show shock. His voice was steady, his movements restrained. The officers realized they had a difficult job ahead of them. All the evidence had to be scrutinized before any conclusions could be drawn. Based on the examination of the scene, the investigators began to form their first hypotheses. Judging by the signs of struggle, the attack was not sudden. The conflict probably developed gradually, and Rachel tried to defend herself to the last. Scattered things, damaged furniture, and traces of blood on the walls indicated the chaotic nature of the incident. The main murder weapon was a pair of scissors found near the body. The injuries on the victim's body indicated multiple blows inflicted with force, which refuted the version of a random incident. The atmosphere in the house indicated a serious conflict that escalated into a physical confrontation. The police understood that a detailed analysis of the evidence would have to be conducted, interviewing Todd, neighbors, and family friends to understand exactly what had happened on that fateful day. After examining the scene and collecting the first evidence, Todd Winkler was taken to the police station to give an explanation. He behaved calmly, complied with all demands, and offered no resistance. His demeanor was reserved, with no signs of panic or aggression. He showed none of the emotions one would expect from someone who had just experienced such a serious incident. Investigators began by asking him to describe what had happened in the house. Todd confidently stated that he acted in self-defense. According to him, the conflict with his spouse started because of a discussion about family issues. He claimed that the conversation turned into an argument, during which Rachel lost her temper, grabbed a pair of scissors, and attacked him. He said he tried to stop her, but she continued to act aggressively. In the course of the struggle, without realizing his actions, he found himself in a situation that led to a tragic outcome. According to his version, everything happened very quickly, and he could not fully control the situation. However, investigators noticed some inconsistencies. Todd did receive injuries during the conflict, but their nature raised questions. There were shallow cuts and scratches on his hands and forearms, indicative of a struggle, but their location was more indicative of Rachel's attempts to defend herself than a targeted attack. Todd himself referred to these injuries as kill or die, emphasizing that he was acting in a moment of mortal danger. Nevertheless, the experts paid attention to the house's furnishings and evidence of the incident. Everything pointed to a prolonged struggle, not a momentary act of self-defense. The arrangement of the furniture, the nature of the marks, and the direction of the wounds indicated that the situation had developed in stages rather than chaotically. This cast doubt on Todd's version of a sudden attack and forced defense. Further examination of the circumstances revealed that the couple had a troubled relationship. Those close to Rachel said that in recent months she had been contemplating divorce. Her mood changed. She became more closed, sharing her worries with her friends. According to some acquaintances, she felt that the family tension was growing and tried to find a way out of the situation. While checking Todd's biography, investigators came across another unexpected fact, which made them look at what happened from a new angle. Several years ago, Todd had already faced a tragic family situation. His first wife, Catherine Winkler, died as a result of an accident. According to the official version, she was in an accident. Her car flew off the road and caught fire. At the time, the case did not raise questions, as there were no obvious signs of third-party intervention. However, now, in light of the events that took place, the investigators decided to review the circumstances of that tragedy more closely. In examining the details, it turned out that shortly before the accident, Catherine and Todd had seen each other. According to some evidence, they may have had an argument, but in the materials of the past investigation, this fact was not considered in detail. Now, detectives began to wonder, was that accident really an accident? Or were not all the circumstances considered at the time? The coincidence of two tragic incidents in the life of one person, albeit a few years apart, could not go unnoticed by the investigation. Of course, there was no direct evidence of a connection between the two cases, but the fact that both his wives died under circumstances that were not entirely clear forced investigators to look more closely into his past. In addition to the main version of self-defense, which was put forward by Todd, the investigators began to form alternative hypotheses that explain the possible causes of the conflict. One of them was the version that Todd had certain information that only his wife knew. Perhaps he was afraid that, having made the decision to leave, she would tell something important that could affect his life. Detectives discovered that Rachel was seriously considering divorce, and her plans could pose a threat to Todd not only in terms of family matters, but also in a broader context. The investigation was looking into whether she might have had information that could damage his reputation or career. If she did have some facts that she was going to share with others, it could explain why their argument took such a sharp turn. Another important aspect was the financial circumstances. As a man who had achieved success in his professional field, Todd was used to a stable standard of living. However, in recent years, his situation had become less stable. The company he worked for had fallen on hard times, which affected his income. Divorce could lead to serious financial losses, since, according to California state law, Rachel was entitled to claim a significant portion of the marital estate, alimony, and financial support for the children. If Todd realized that divorce was inevitable, he may have feared these consequences. In addition, detectives began checking for information about possible debts or unstable investments associated with Todd. If he was indeed having financial difficulties, The conflict with his wife could have been exacerbated amid discussions about property division. There were no definitive conclusions yet, but investigators realized that a more detailed investigation was necessary. They continued to analyze evidence, review correspondence, examine phone calls, and interview acquaintances of the family to gather a complete picture of events. After the initial interview with Todd Winkler, the investigation began to gather additional information that could help reconstruct an accurate picture of the events. To do so, officers began interviewing Rachel's friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. Their testimony could shed light on the couple's relationship and possible motives for the conflict. The first person called for an interview was one of her close friends, who knew the situation in the family well. He said that in recent months, Rachel had become more withdrawn, often talked about problems in the marriage, and complained about her husband's unstable behavior. According to him, she wanted to leave Todd and considered divorce, but feared that it would cause an unpredictable reaction from his side. Other acquaintances confirmed that she often shared her worries. Her friend, with whom she kept in touch almost daily, said that in the days before the tragedy, Rachel seemed anxious. She said Todd was becoming increasingly irritable, controlling her actions and possibly guessing that she was going to leave. Rachel's co-workers also contributed to the investigation. They noted that she had changed some time ago. Whereas before she was always open and cheerful, lately she seemed depressed. One of the employees mentioned that in the weeks before the incident, she had come to work in a tense state and once even missed an important meeting, which was uncharacteristic of her. But the most significant information was provided by one of her close colleagues who had worked with her for the past few years. He was aware of the complicated relationship in the family and confirmed that Rachel was afraid of her husband's possible reaction to her leaving. According to him, she even mentioned that Todd once told her, "If you leave, you'll regret it." This evidence became important to the investigation because it showed that the conflict in the family was protracted and also emphasized the possibility of pre-planned violence on Todd's part. In addition to witness testimony, investigators continued to review the evidence found at the scene. Their analysis revealed additional evidence that events did not unfold as Todd claimed. First, examination of the signs of a struggle in the room showed that the conflict lasted longer than it would have in a case of sudden self-defense. The scattered objects, the nature of the damage to the furniture, and the positioning of the body indicated that there had been an active fight in which one party was attempting to escape. Secondly, the examination of the weapon confirmed that the blows were purposeful. The angle and depth of the wounds indicated that the assailant's actions were controlled and consistent, which was inconsistent with Todd's claim that he acted in panic. In addition, investigators discovered an important detail. Rachel's hands showed signs of defensive movements. This indicated that she was trying to stop the attack, not acting as an attacker as her spouse claimed. Forensics also analyzed Todd's clothing. Stains on the fabric indicated that he was in close proximity to the victim at the time of the tragedy, and the distribution of marks spoke of multiple interactions rather than a single movement caused by self-defense. Additionally, data from her cell phone was examined. On the day of the incident, she attempted to make a call, but the connection failed. This indirectly confirmed that she felt threatened and tried to contact someone moments before the tragedy. All of this data allowed investigators to draw an important conclusion. Todd's version that he was defending himself from the attack did not fit the facts. However, another interrogation was necessary before a final charge could be made. When Todd Winkler was re-invited for questioning, he was noticeably less confident than the first time. The investigators presented him with the results of expert examinations and witness testimony that suggested that his version of events did not correspond to reality. Under the pressure of the evidence gathered, Todd changed his initial position. He admitted that he had felt intense anger during the conflict and indeed wanted his wife to stop resisting. However, he continued to argue that he acted in self-defense. He attributed his actions to the fact that he felt threatened by Rachel and did not know how else to stop her. This partial revision of his words was not a full admission of guilt, but showed that his previous version was incomplete. The investigation understood that he didn't want to completely recant the self-defense claims, but the evidence gathered told a different story. After questioning, detectives concluded that Todd was aware of his actions, and his motives may have been related not only to the immediate conflict, but also to the long-term circumstances that led to the tragedy. Now the case was to move to the next level. Formal charges were to be filed. Todd Winkler was to be arrested and prepared for trial. After months of investigation, analyzing evidence, and preparing materials, Todd Winkler's case went to trial. The trial took place in El Dorado County, California. The prosecution argued that Todd Winkler intentionally took the life of his wife Rachel during the conflict, and then tried to present what happened as self-defense. The defense, in turn, insisted that the defendant acted under stress and was only trying to save himself from his wife's aggressive attack. The courtroom was filled with journalists, Rachel's relatives, colleagues, and family friends. Many of them followed the case closely, hoping that the judicial system would be able to deliver a fair verdict. The prosecution presented a consistent picture of events based on witness testimony and forensic evidence. The prosecution pointed to a number of pieces of evidence that cast doubt on Todd's version of self-defense. Experts found that the nature of Rachel's injuries and signs of a struggle indicated that he was in control of the situation and his actions were not forced. Witnesses confirmed that shortly before the tragedy, she felt fear of her spouse, wanted to leave, but feared his reaction. Also, investigators paid attention to Todd's past. His first wife died under mysterious circumstances, and now this fact seemed disturbing. Additionally, a financial motive was considered, as the divorce threatened his financial situation. Prosecutors also noted that Todd repeatedly showed signs of aggression and temper in his daily life, making his version of self-defense less plausible. Todd Winkler's attorneys based their strategy on the claim that he was in a desperate situation and did not want to commit a crime. They claimed that the conflict came out of the blue and their client was protecting himself from an imminent threat. The defense also tried to focus on the wounds that Todd had sustained, claiming that they were evidence of a serious fight and confirmed his fear for his life. In addition, the defense attorneys attempted to discredit the prosecution's financial motive, arguing that Todd was not in a critical financial situation and therefore had no reason to eliminate his spouse for money. Despite these arguments, the defense failed to convincingly explain why the nature of Rachel's injuries and the location of the evidence contradicted Todd's version. When it came time for Todd Winkler himself to testify, he was reserved, but his emotional state changed as the questioning progressed. In the beginning, he claimed that he deeply regretted what had happened and would never wish his wife dead. He again spoke of a moment he called "kill or die," explaining that he had been forced to defend himself. On cross-examination, however, the prosecutor asked him some tough questions about the logic of his actions. The question as to why he did not have serious injuries that would be expected in the event of an active attack stumped him. When asked why he did not leave the room or try to avoid the conflict if he truly felt threatened, Todd was unable to give a clear answer. The moment that caused the most tension in the room was when the prosecutor read a portion of his testimony from a previous interrogation, where he admitted that he was feeling a lot of anger at the time and wanted Rachel to stop resisting. This fact played a key role in shaping the jury's opinion. After several weeks of deliberations, the jury retired to deliberate. The decision was made relatively quickly, which may have indicated that the prosecution's evidence was sufficiently compelling. On October 10, 2014, the jury found Todd Winkler guilty of second-degree murder, finding that his actions were not justified by self-defense. The judge imposed a final sentence later. In 2015, Winkler was sentenced to 26 years in prison. The decision was an important step toward justice for Rachel's family. There were quiet sobs in the courtroom. Her loved ones, who had waited months for this moment, finally heard that the guilty party would be punished. The court put an end to the case, and Todd would have years to reflect on his actions. Hannah Hill was born on January 11, 1981, in Akron, Ohio, to Elsa and Kimberly Hill. The only daughter in the family, she grew up in care and love. Her parents always tried to give her the best despite the fact that they lived modestly. Akron was a small industrial town in Summit County where most residents worked in factories or in the service industry. Hill's family lived in the Kenmore neighborhood where her childhood took place. Hannah was an ordinary American girl of the late 90s, smiling, sociable with a kind heart. As a child, she was interested in dancing, participated in school plays, and dreamed of working in fashion or design. She attended the local high school where, although she was not an excellent student, she was respected by her teachers for her diligence and friendly nature. Her surroundings always described her as an honest and sincere person who easily found a common language with people. In 1999, when she turned 18, Hannah was graduating from high school and planned to go to college. There were no serious conflicts in her life. She rarely quarreled with her parents, preferring to spend her free time with friends or helping her mother around the house. She already had plans for the future. Hannah was going to find a summer job to save money for her studies, but fate had it differently. That same year, a few months before the tragic events, Hannah met Danny Ross. Danny Ross was born in 1979 and grew up in the same Akron. Unlike Hannah, his childhood could not be called carefree. He grew up in a dysfunctional family, often witnessed the quarrels of his parents. As a teenager, he developed discipline problems and was arrested by the police several times for petty theft and fights. By the age of 20, Ross was leading a lifestyle that was far from stable. He worked at various places but never stayed anywhere for long. According to the memories of his acquaintances, he had problems with aggression and outbursts of rage, especially when it came to women. Many of the girls he dated later admitted that they sensed something disturbing in his behavior, but did not pay attention to it. He met Hannah through mutual friends. Ross was older than her by 2 years, but it did not embarrass the girl. At first, he seemed to her charming, able to speak beautiful words, gave the impression of a man who knows what he wants from life. Hannah, trusting by nature, did not see him as a threat. Their relationship could not be called serious. Rather, it was a friendship with elements of sympathy. They spent time together, sometimes going to the city, watching movies, chatting in the company. But soon Hannah began to notice something strange about him. Ross became aggressive if something went wrong, could suddenly yell or spoil the mood with harsh remarks. At some point, the girl decided to reduce communication. However, on that May evening, she still agreed to meet him, not suspecting that this would be her last mistake. On May 19, 1999, around 7:30 p.m., Hannah left the house after dinner. She told her parents that she would be back soon, but did not specify where she was going. They didn't ask too many questions. Their daughter was an adult and always responsible for her actions. Hours passed. Night fell on Akron, and Hannah still hadn't returned. Her parents began to worry. They called her cell phone, but the phone was turned off. By the next morning, the anxiety had only gotten worse. This wasn't like her. Kimberly Hill called her daughter's friends, but no one had seen her since the evening before. The only thing they could find out was that she was going to meet Danny Ross. The parents contacted the police, but they were assured there was no cause for concern yet. Maybe she just went somewhere with friends. Teenagers do that a lot, they were told. But the family knew. This didn't sound like Hannah. A week passed. The hope of finding her alive faded with each passing day. But on May 26, a resident of the Ellet neighborhood, just a mile from Ross's apartment, spotted an abandoned car. It was a gold Geo Prism. The car had been parked in the same spot for days. The man called the police several times, but it wasn't until after the 5th call that a patrol crew finally arrived on the scene. What they found inside started one of the longest investigations in Summit County history. When police arrived on a call to an abandoned vehicle on Kane Road in the Ellet neighborhood, patrol officers immediately noticed details that pointed to strange circumstances. A gold-colored Geo Prism that belonged to Hannah Hill had been parked on the curb for several days. The car was covered in a layer of street dust, its windows slightly fogged. As if there had been no air movement inside for a long time, no one had approached it or tried to open it or steal it. The car doors were locked. An initial inspection through the glass yielded no answers. There were no signs of struggle on the front seats and no keys in the ignition. However, there was some dark cloth lying on the back seat, barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. One of the officers carefully ran his finger over the glass, wiping away the dust, and peered inside. At that moment, he noticed something alarming. On the inside of the windshield, there were barely visible palm prints, as if someone had tried to get out. Suspecting something wrong, the police called in experts and opened the car. A slight musty odor was immediately felt inside, which could only mean one thing: there was a body inside. The trunk took the brunt of the impact. When they opened it, the picture before them left more questions than answers. Inside the trunk was the body of a young girl wrapped in a cloth. It was Hannah Hill. Her body had already begun to decompose, but from external signs, it could be determined that the death had occurred several days ago. The police immediately cordoned off the scene, leaving no chance for evidence to be contaminated. When forensic investigators carefully unwrapped the cloth, they saw that Hannah was wearing the same clothes she had left the house in: jeans and a light-colored t-shirt. However, the fabric of her clothes was stained in several places. Bruises were found on the girl's skin, especially in the area of her hands and wrists, indicating a struggle. Her face also showed signs of blows. Her cheekbones looked swollen and her lower lip was slightly chapped. But the most ominous detail was that her neck seemed overly stretched, as if someone had squeezed her throat with force. There were no signs of stab wounds or gunshot wounds, but there was terror in Hannah's eyes. Forensic doctors suggested that the cause of death could have been asphyxiation, strangulation, but for now it remained only a theory. Only further forensic tests could clarify it. Examination of the scene of the accident caused investigators a lot of questions. The car had not been broken into, which could mean that Hannah had gotten into it herself, probably trusting the person who was nearby. However, where exactly the incident took place remained unclear. Only small traces of blood were found in the trunk, not enough to say that the tragedy happened there. Some evidence pointed to a possible struggle. Abrasions and bruises were found on Hannah's arms, which could indicate an attempt to resist. A small blood stain was found on her t-shirt, which investigators believe may not have been hers alone. They also found microparticles of skin under the girl's fingernails, which could indicate physical contact with someone before the tragedy. Of particular interest were palm prints on the windshield, which could indicate an attempt to get out of the car. All these details required further investigation to understand what happened in the last minutes of Hannah's life. Detectives who arrived on the scene attempted to reconstruct a picture of the events. Based on the position of the body and the nature of the injuries, they hypothesized that Hannah had probably been strangled by hand. Perhaps it had happened elsewhere and then her body had been moved to the car. Also disconcerting was the fact that there were no signs of violence in the interior of the car. No torn clothes, no scattered objects. This meant that everything had happened quickly, either in a different location or at a time when Hannah hadn't expected an attack. The police immediately began looking at her circle of acquaintances. One of the first on the list of suspects was Danny Ross, the same man she'd last met before she disappeared. But there was one problem: there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder. Yet, at first glance, everything seemed to indicate that the crime had been carefully planned. The killer had acted in cold blood, left no obvious signs of a struggle, or attempted to hide the body in a deserted location. Instead, he simply left the car on a quiet street in a residential neighborhood, hoping it wouldn't be discovered right away. It seemed like an odd decision for a man who wanted to get away with it. However, the investigation puzzled several questions. Why didn't the killer dispose of the car by drowning it in a lake or hiding it in the woods? After all, leaving it in plain sight is a big risk. If Hannah was killed elsewhere, why were her clothes left relatively clean, with no signs of dirt or transportation? And finally, and most importantly, why leave the body behind when you could have hidden it forever? The young girl's death shocked all of Akron. The next day, the first notice of the tragedy appeared in the city news. Hannah's parents were in utter despair. They couldn't understand why anyone would do such a thing. In the meantime, the police were busy checking all of Hannah's contacts over the past week. One important point was to establish her last phone call. Cell phone records showed that her last call was around 7:50 p.m. the day she disappeared. And the call was to Danny Ross. Now the police have their first real lead. Ross was the last person to see Hannah alive, but how do we prove his involvement? The first interviews with Danny Ross did not give the investigation a clear answer. He confidently stated that he had not seen Hannah that night and had nothing to do with her disappearance. He insisted that he had spent time at home and did not notice anything suspicious. However, when the investigators began to clarify the details, inconsistencies appeared in his words. He was confused about the sequence of events, could not be sure of the exact time, and changed his answers several times. This could have been normal excitement or stress from the situation, but the investigation couldn't ignore it. After the discovery of Hannah Hill's body, the circle of suspects was immediately narrowed down. The investigation found out that the last time the girl called Danny Ross. Moreover, Hannah's friends confirmed that she planned to meet him that night. Ross, however, categorically denied having seen her the night she disappeared. He assured police that he was at home and had nothing to do with the incident. But inconsistencies in his words, as well as some circumstantial evidence, led the investigation to take a closer look at him. A year after the tragedy in 2000, Danny Ross went on trial. The prosecution relied on several important circumstances. First, the last person Hannah Hill contacted before her disappearance was Ross. Her phone call on the evening of May 19 was corroborated by the service provider's records. Second, Ross denied seeing Hannah that evening, which raised questions for the investigation since all the facts said otherwise. Third, investigators found evidence that pointed to a possible struggle. There were abrasions and bruises on the girl's body, and microparticles of skin were found under her fingernails, which could indicate her attempt to defend herself. The main difficulty, however, was that the prosecutor's office had no direct evidence linking Ross to the crime scene. There were no witnesses who saw him commit the crime, and the evidence found was circumstantial. Nevertheless, the investigation insisted that he was responsible for Hannah's death. The trial lasted several weeks. The prosecution argued the case, the defense argued the case. Danny Ross was restrained, at times even confident. He denied all the charges, called them investigative error, and emphasized that there was no evidence against him. But when the case came to a verdict, there was an unexpected turn. One of the jurors committed a procedural error that cast doubt on the entire trial. The juror was found to have discussed the case outside the courtroom, which is strictly prohibited, and could have affected the impartiality of the court. Based on this, the judge declared a mistrial. This meant that the verdict was nullified and Ross could not be found guilty or innocent. The trial had to be stopped and the judicial machine came to a standstill. After the announced mistrial, Ross escaped conviction. He wasn't acquitted, but he wasn't found guilty either. This created a legal trap. If prosecutors tried him again on the same charges, the defense could claim double jeopardy, which prohibits retrial for the same crime. While at large, Ross went on with his life. However, public opinion in Akron was far from being on his side. Many people in the city believed that he had gotten away with it not because he was innocent, but because of legal difficulties. But as time went on, Hannah Hill's case hit a legal dead end. For 12 years, the case went unmoved, and Hannah's family continued to live with pain and unanswered questions. By 2012, there were important changes in forensic science. Advances in DNA analysis technology made it possible to examine evidence with a high degree of accuracy. What was impossible in 1999 has now become a key investigative tool. Investigators decided to reanalyze the evidence found in Hannah's car. Among them was a tiny bloodstain on her t-shirt, which in 1999 could not be fully analyzed. Now, using new methods, experts have revealed that the DNA in that stain belongs to Danny Ross. This fact completely refuted his previous testimony. Ross had previously claimed that he had not seen Hannah that night. However, the investigation now had direct biological evidence that he not only saw her, but was in physical contact with her at the time of the tragedy. With new evidence coming to light, the Summit County Prosecutor's Office decided to reopen the case. Despite the legal challenges, they found a loophole that allowed the charges to be filed again. Since Ross had not been acquitted in 2000 and the trial was invalidated, the law allowed for a retrial. The prosecution claimed they now had indisputable proof of Danny Ross's guilt. DNA on the victim's clothing, which indicated physical contact, contradicted his earlier words. This meant that not only had he lied in interrogations, but he had been hiding the truth all along. The trial was coming up again, but this time the investigation was confident. Now they would be able to bring the case to a conclusion. When in 2012 investigators received new evidence linking Danny Ross to the case of Hannah Hill, the first step was to establish his whereabouts. However, as it turned out, there was no need to look for him. Ross was already in a correctional facility, serving a 25-year sentence for another crime. In 2004, he was convicted of assaulting a 26-year-old woman in Akron. This was of particular interest to investigators because the circumstances of this case had similarities to the events of 1999. They wondered, could this information have helped shed light on Hannah's disappearance and death? On the evening of July 3, 2004, a 26-year-old Akron resident met Danny Ross at a bar. Ross gave the impression of an outgoing and friendly person. He joked, showed attention, and seemed trustworthy. Later, when the establishment closed, he offered her a ride home, to which she agreed. However, she said, after she got into his car, the situation changed dramatically. Instead of driving her home, Ross headed in the direction of his apartment. The woman claimed she felt alarmed and asked him to turn around, but he ignored her request. When they arrived at his apartment, Ross allegedly tried to talk her into staying, but she refused. It was then, the victim alleged, that he became aggressive, first verbally and then physically. He kept her in the room, threatening that she would not leave until he wanted her to. At that point, she had no way to call for help. The woman said Ross used force and committed a felony against her. He then, she said, let his guard down for a while and she managed to escape. She immediately contacted the police and within days of the incident, Ross was arrested. Forensics confirmed her words. There were signs of a struggle on her body and tests confirmed the violent nature of the attack. In 2005, a court found him guilty and he received a $25 sentence. His birth certificate was confirmed, and he received a second wife and For investigators working on the Hannah Hill case, the 2004 crime was a key link in the investigation. They saw obvious similarities. Ross knew both victims, and there were signs of struggle and force in both cases. However, in 2004, the victim was able to survive and tell her side of the story, whereas Hannah did not have that opportunity. These parallels led investigators to look deeper into the circumstances of her death. When investigators arrived at the correctional facility to interview Danny Ross, he already knew that the Hannah Hill case was back in the spotlight. For years, he had maintained that he had not seen her that night and had nothing to do with her disappearance. But now the investigation possessed new evidence that wasn't there in 2002. The first blow to Ross was the DNA stain on Hannah's clothes, discovered using modern technology. Forensics showed that the biological material belonged to him. It completely contradicted his previous testimony. If he hadn't seen Hannah that night, how could his DNA be on her t-shirt? Ross went silent. He tried to explain it otherwise, but his words sounded unconvincing. The investigators continued to insist. They presented an analysis of the microparticles found in Hannah's car. The experts found traces of fibers that matched the textiles found in Ross's apartment. This could indicate that Hannah may have been in his home. The third piece of evidence was the analysis of microparticles found under Hannah's fingernails. Now, thanks to new research methods, it turned out that they also belonged to Ross. With this evidence, the situation became even more complicated for him. The investigators were blunt. They have evidence that confirms that he had contact with Hannah on the day of her disappearance. After a lengthy interrogation, Danny Ross changed his original version. He now did not deny that he had seen Hannah that evening and admitted that she had come to his apartment. However, according to him, they just talked, after which the girl left. Investigators realized that this was not the whole truth. If Hannah did leave his house, how do they explain Ross's DNA on her clothes? Why were pieces of his skin under her fingernails? And how did her body end up in the trunk of her car left near his apartment? He had no answers to these questions. After carefully analyzing the evidence gathered, the Summit County Prosecutor's Office decided to reopen the trial. Although the 2000 trial had been invalidated, this allowed the case to be retried. In October 2012, it was officially announced that Denny Ross would be retried. The prosecution now had stronger evidence. Investigators and prosecutors were confident that this time they could present a convincing picture of what had happened. For Hannah Hill's family, it meant a long-awaited opportunity to get answers to the questions that had haunted them all these years. In October 2012, 13 years after the tragedy, Danny Ross went on trial again. This trial was different from the previous one. This time, the prosecution had strong evidence that was previously missing. The trial promised to be complex and emotional, especially for Hannah Hill's family, who had waited years for justice. The Summit County Prosecutor's Office presented an updated list of evidence that played a crucial role in the prosecution. They now had not only circumstantial evidence in the form of Hannah's phone call to Ross, but also concrete biological evidence. At the heart of the prosecution's case were several key pieces of evidence that allowed the investigation to build a convincing picture of what had happened. The most important was the DNA of Danny Ross found on Hannah's t-shirt, which confirmed their physical contact on the day of her disappearance. There were skin particles under the girl's fingernails, which could indicate a struggle. There were trace amounts of textiles on her clothes that matched materials from Ross's apartment, confirming her presence there. All of this evidence contradicted his initial testimony and became crucial in the trial. In addition, prosecutors used the precedent of the 2004 case to show a similar pattern of behavior by the defendant. The judge allowed these materials to be used as additional evidence because they could help establish the defendant's pattern of behavior. The trial took place in the Summit County Circuit Court, with Judge Judy Hunter presiding. 12 jurors participated in the trial, 9 of whom were women, which added important context given the nature of the charges. The prosecution presented its case clearly and consistently. Prosecutors explained in detail how the new technology revealed evidence that was previously unavailable and how it completely refuted Ross's earlier statements. The prosecution presented the court with a consistent version of events based on the evidence collected and new forensic analyses. On May 19, 1999, Hannah Hill left her home and went to the home of Danny Ross, with whom she had previously maintained an acquaintance. Investigators determined that she did make it to his apartment, which was confirmed by the discovery of textile microparticles on her clothing. At some point, there was a struggle between them. Abrasions and bruises were found on the girl's body, and skin particles were found under her fingernails, indicating an attempt to resist. According to the investigation, Hannah was strangled. The causes of her death were consistent with the traces of strangulation revealed by forensic medical examination. After that, the girl's body was placed in the trunk of her own car and left in a residential area. The killer probably hoped the car would not be found right away, but neighbors spotted it sooner than he expected. Detectives and forensic scientists who testified gave detailed accounts of the investigation. They explained why the case did not reach its logical conclusion in 2000 and how new technology changed the investigation years later. The defense side, led by attorney Roger Sinberg, tried to build a strategy on doubting the evidence. He insisted that Ross's DNA on Hannah's clothes did not prove he was responsible for her death. "Yes, my client now admits he saw Hannah, but that doesn't make him a murderer," the defense attorney argued. He also tried to cast doubt on the evidence, pointing to the possibility that it may have been contaminated in the years since the crime. However, DNA experts categorically rejected this argument, explaining that the analysis was conducted using modern technology to ensure accuracy. Additionally, the defense tried to emphasize the lack of direct witnesses who could prove that the crime took place in Ross's apartment. They pointed out that Hannah's whereabouts that night were not recorded by security cameras, and Ross himself had always denied any involvement in her disappearance. But all of these arguments were weakened by the actual evidence. The most emotional moment of the trial was the presentation of Hannah Hill's parents. Her mother, Kimberly Hill, addressed the court saying, "We have waited 13 years to find out the truth. For 13 years we lived with the idea that our daughter didn't get justice. Now we have proof. Now we have a chance. We just want Hannah to finally find peace." Her father, Elsa Hill, also expressed hope that this time the court would not let the crime go unpunished. After 7 weeks of trial, the jury retired for deliberations. They deliberated for 3 full days and part of 2 additional days, indicating the complexity of the decision. On October 5, 2012, a Summit County court found Denny Ross guilty of 2 counts of murder, aggravated assault, concealing evidence, and abuse of the deceased's body. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.